Muin Academy, located on the lands of the Pristan Empire, one of the educational institutions. It was created to train qualified specialists in various fields, such as fencing magic or science. Every year, young people came from all over the continent to enter the academy. Sometime later, the young people looked closely at the list of those admitted. Everyone was surprised as unknown Elena Evoy Zed took first place. The young man looked at the list in surprise. A moment later, he beamed and congratulated the young lady on her first place. Everyone said that the young man was simply an angel incarnate, since he was not envious, but sincerely congratulated the winner. He smiled because he was happy to hear such things about himself. He regretted that he did not take first place. He looked at the lady intently, as if he wanted her to admire his generosity. The young lady in turn looked at him intently and thanked him. He froze in place in surprise and did not know what to answer. She looked at him intently and asked if he had anything else to tell her. She looked at him casually and said that if he didn't want to say anything, then she would leave. It was at that moment that he felt like he could hear his self-respect cracking at the seams. Yohak Eldorado Pertain is the fifth nephew of the current emperor. From birth, he was a treasured member of the imperial family. Be it fencing magic or science, he was excellent in everything, and all the teachers praised him. His name became famous due to the fact that for several years, he annually took first place in the academy. He had sparkling as if sprinkled with gold light hair, and shining eyes, as if holding the whole sky within themselves. He was the owner of such an excellent appearance that he could charm anyone with just one smile. All the girls admired him, and it seemed to them that he was bright and cloudless. The young man was puzzled and did not understand where the young lady had come from, as he knew that he always had to take first place. Some time later, he was sitting in class and listening to his classmates talking. They were discussing the young lady's rudeness towards him. He thought for a moment, as this was the first time he had heard of the young lady. He remembered everyone, but unfortunately, he knew nothing about the young lady's house. A moment later, he threw all his thoughts away as he saw a young lady standing next to him. He saw that she was very modest and neat, but he noticed that she had distinctive purple hair. He noticed that her face was like a piece of ice, making it difficult to determine her emotions. He thought that she was just an ice cube. The young lady asked him with a smile what he was looking at so intently. He smiled and said that the sky was very clear today. He looked at all the ladies with a radiant smile because he knew that he was not interested in any sky at all. All that worried him was the looks of those who were watching him. Even though he occupied a high position in society, he worried about little things. While remaining compassionate, gentle, and overall a perfect person, he was one to be watched constantly. The ladies wanted to know if he had decided on a specialty, since they knew that his father was known as the best knight in the empire. They said that Isaac graduated from the academy and also joined the ranks of the royal guard. Johann V shuddered at the mention of the young man. Head of the Duchy of Pertin, first son of Noah Mason Pertin, and the second son Isaac Schvidel Pertin. The two incredible brothers who glorified the duke's name were his light and shadow. Since Isaac is their second son at home, they are only 1 year apart from each other and have always been compared to each other. Always to be the one who stayed behind his brothers, but not to lag so far behind that he did not live up to the reputation of the house. That was his role. He said with a beaming smile that he was considering other directions and had not yet decided. They smiled and said that he also had a talent for magic. A moment later, he heard someone in the distance discussing the Viscountcy Evoy, since no one has ever heard of such a thing before. They whispered and speculated, and Johann P. realized that no one knew where the young lady was from. The lady said that the first head of the Viscounty Evoy, known by the name of Ruth, they had previously heard of the magician Gagata. The lady said the man was avoiding people, so he decided to give up his title and became a viscount. They said that it was very difficult to find any information about the lady. The young man sat quietly and heard their conversations. He looked at the lady as everyone was talking very loudly, and he thought that the content of their conversation must be unpleasant to her. He froze in surprise as he saw that she was not paying any attention to them. He thought there were several options as to why she wasn't paying attention to them. Either she's too focused or not bright, or she just doesn't care. He knew that no matter how brilliant he was, he had to know the line. The man told him to remember what his role was in the duchy. He looked at the young man with anger and said that he could not be better than his brothers, and he should not try to leave his place. He exhaled heavily because he knew that this was very depressing. He looked out the window intently as he wanted to go out for a little walk later and throw away all his thoughts. Some time later, he went out into the garden to take a walk. He knew that the garden could not even be compared to the garden of an ordinary aristocrat. A moment later, he froze in place as he saw a young lady walking by. He looked at her in surprise and slowly came closer, calling her. One of the many gods mentioned in the legend about the founding of the empire was the god of love, Peony. There was a legend that whoever wished for love would receive it. He had only to take the statue by the hand and make his wish. He was surprised that she believed in it. Johann didn't think she was interested in a relationship with anyone because he constantly saw her cold expression on her face. She said that she was working now, and he was disturbing her. She said that if he was going to admire the statue, he should wait a little. The young man froze in surprise when she said she was working. He looked at her closely and asked what she meant by work. She said she was taking care of the statue. Elena S. said that she was a little busy at the moment. She told him that if he was enjoying the walk, he should continue doing it. He looked at her in surprise and asked for what purpose she did such a thing. She said that the purpose of her work is to earn money. She works with the permission of the academy. The young man was shocked. He couldn't believe that the academy had hired a student. He knew that, of course, the cost of education at the academy was not small, but he knew that the young lady was a noblewoman. He knew that there are cases when, in order to acquire useful connections, people enter the academy as servants or maids. He left in shock, wondering what kind of house could have raised such a lady. Johann knew he couldn't ask her such a tactless question. He looked at her intently as he realized that he was now irritating her very much with his presence. The young man was a little puzzled, as it was the first time he had been looked at in such a way. And he remembered her look even the next day, and could not forget it. He was often irritated by other people, but it never happened that he was the source of irritation. The young man ran up to his friend and said with a smile that there would be a banquet next week, and his father was really looking forward to it. He smiled and said that since the Marquis was waiting for him, he could not help but come. He said that it was an honor for him. The young man said with a smile that as soon as father saw him, he immediately calmed down. As he left, he smiled and said that they could see each other again later. The young man looked closely at his friend. He thought that he was simply pathetic. Johann knew that he lived relying only on his parents. He sighed heavily, for he knew that the young man was a fool who had no abilities. He looked at the young lady intently and thought for a moment, for he knew that if anyone else saw her, they would begin to whisper. He knew that aristocrats were especially proud, and it was unknown what they would do if they found out that they were losing in everything to the young lady who worked. For a moment he froze and wondered why he cared at all. He was puzzled and did not understand why she was in his thoughts, since they were not connected. The freshmen's meeting focused all the attention on the young lady because they thought she was beautiful. He looked closely at the young lady as he realized that, for the first time in his life, he had lost to someone. He knew that the seemingly impossible had happened, and he had come second. Of course, there was complete chaos in his soul. He was puzzled since for the first time in his life he had a rival. He was also very worried about her strange behavior. He knew the problem was her chilling cold gaze. Her gaze was indifferent, showing nothing benevolent or hostile. He wondered if he was really annoying her, or if it was all an act to hide his true feelings. He understood perfectly well that he needed to observe her for some time longer. Johann did not deny that he was talented from birth, and that this was what distinguished him from the rest. He had a memory that was incomparable to anyone else, and excellent athletic training. Moreover, he grasped everything on the fly. Every time the teachers praised him, because they did not believe that such talent was possible. He was never lazy and tried to do his best, but there is a limit to achieving what he got thanks to his innate talent. He understood perfectly well that this is exactly what had happened now. Johann slowly approached the young lady and called her. He was a little confused, not knowing what to answer. He didn't know if she was happy or if she was just surprised now. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that they had met again. The young lady looked at her companion and in a cold, monotonous voice replied that it was so. Johann looked closely at the young lady and asked if she worked part-time as a librarian. She nodded approvingly. She knew that he could not be called a slow-witted person. On the contrary, he was quite smart, and what his inner instinct told him was perfectly clear. He saw that the young lady was not at all interested in him. She looked at the girl closely and asked if she was taking the book. The lady smiled and said that she was. Wealth, fame, beauty, honor, easy character, and diligent behavior are the ideal criteria for friendship. He was a well-known figure in the academy, and simply a bright young man. But for the young lady, he was no one else. She ignored him in every possible way. Obeying her philosophy, the young lady did not crave either desserts, which she could not eat with ugly clothes, or a comfortable life. Now, he was also something she could never achieve. It was more like gold embroidery on expensive silk, like a diamond of the highest quality. Elena sighed, knowing they had run into each other too often. He didn't look for her specifically. She knew that they literally met in every place where she worked. He said with a smile that she was a very busy person, but despite all this, she took first place. He said that she was truly incredible. She saw that he did not spread rumors about her, as he was worried about. She was glad that she had decided to pay for her tuition and dorm. She wanted to send money home for food. She thought for a moment, knowing that it wouldn't hurt to call a doctor to the house either. The honor of the Viscount lasted only until the time of the first Viscount, who was widely known as an outstanding magician. Unfortunately, such an outstanding talent never appeared in subsequent generations, and eventually the young lady's father appeared, and all the wealth was lost. That although they didn't have incredible talent, they lived conscientiously and honestly, trying their best to do at least something. She told the young lady that managing small territories was also a very important job. She said that everyone trusted her father and asked him to do some errands, so he was very busy. However, their happiness did not last long. An accident happened with the Viscount's carriage. It all happened during his working trip to the Duke's tiny lands. Later illness took hold of the Viscountess, and the young lady lost her father when she was 7 years old. Taking care of her sick mother, she matured much earlier than her peers. She hoped that her mother was doing well. She wanted to see her as soon as possible. The young lady greeted her new roommate with a radiant smile. She said with a smile that there had been a small incident on the way, and she had been delayed, but in any case, they would now live together in the same room. Jilly, with a smile, told everything about her neighbor. The young lady was puzzled because she lived alone, but now her loneliness came to an end. She looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was feeling okay after the trip. Jilly looked at her neighbor in surprise, as she did not understand what she was talking about. Elena S. said that some kind of incident had happened on the way. She smiled and said that nothing terrible had happened, and she was perfectly fine. She was surprised that her neighbor had listened to her so attentively. She looked closely at the young lady and asked what she was embroidering. She was wondering if she really wanted to give someone a gift. Elena S. said that she would sell the products. The lady was surprised, but she decided to quickly change the topic. She said that the academy was very big. She looked at her neighbor and asked if her activities took up a lot of time. Elena Kolodno said that they took up a lot of time. A young lady with tears in her eyes asked her neighbor if she could give her a short tour of the academy. Elena S. told her friend that she didn't seem to have received an academy card, but she had one and would lend it to her. She was shocked and screamed that her neighbor was very cold and that people needed to be helped. Elena S. said that she agreed, but it was difficult now. While she was juggling studies and work, she couldn't waste time. She knew that friends were important, but friends alone wouldn't keep you full. Jilly Woo smiled and said that if they went together, she would buy something delicious. The young lady quickly agreed. Sometime later, they were walking around the academy's grounds. The young lady looked at her neighbor and asked who was there in the distance. She looked intently at the young man and said that he was like a prince. Elena looked intently at the young man and said that he was not a prince, but just Johann. She knew that he was indeed a member of the imperial family, since he was the son of a duke. She smiled and said that she needed to go to the administrative building and get something. The young lady sighed heavily as she thought that life in the dormitory had become more tiring. A moment later, she heard someone calling her. She turned around and saw a young man next to her. He looked at her intently and with a beaming smile asked what she was doing there. She said she was showing the academy to her neighbor. He smiled and said it looked like she was working as a guide. She thought about it because she got food for it. She said that this was not true at all, since her roommate had recently arrived, so she showed her. He was surprised that his neighbor arrived at such a time. He smiled and said that thanks to her, he wasn't bored. The young lady looked at him with a smile and said that that was exactly it. Johann Z froze in surprise and wondered if she had just smiled at him. She looked at the young man and said that her roommate would be back soon. She said that if her neighbor saw him, she would want to stay. He puzzled said that in that case, he would go first. Elena wished him a good journey with a smile He smiled and also wished her a good journey. The young man was a little puzzled, as he did not understand why she suddenly smiled at him. Even noticing it, she smiled and wondered if it was because he saw her so often that she felt comfortable with him. Jilly looked intently at her neighbor and asked why she hadn't woken her up in the morning, but had simply left. Elena S. said that she tried to wake her up, but she did not wake up. Young ladies in the distance were whispering about young girls. Johann S. sat and ate quietly, thinking about how his new roommate turned out to be a princess. The kingdom of Deuton as a nation of warriors that strives for self-sufficiency. Even though it is a little poor, it is hidden due to its extremely closed nature. He didn't know if the young lady knew that her roommate was a member of the royal family. He thought that she wasn't interested in such matters. He knew that in any case, her smiling face was incredibly beautiful. The young man froze in shock and wondered what he had just thought. He didn't understand what was beautiful there. He knew that the young lady was the one who could become an obstacle in his path. He knew that something had happened to him that he could not imagine, and apparently he was unable to properly comprehend the situation. The young man was leisurely strolling through the academy in the evening. He froze in surprise when he saw the young lady. She looked at him in surprise and called out. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was really using magic now. She said that last time she couldn't wipe all the way up, and in order to get there, she needed magic. He knew that this method was safer than climbing the statue by hanging it with a rope, but the use of magic was strictly prohibited in the academy. She looked intently at the young man and asked if he had anything to say. He looked at her in surprise. She said that it seemed like they were constantly colliding. Johann said with a smile that it was an accident. He knew that it was half true and half not. He was fixated on her because she was the first person among the aristocrats who made him feel defeated. He knew that if his father saw this picture now, he would look at him with contempt. The young lady looked closely at the young man and said that he was not smiling. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She said excitedly that he usually smiled a lot. She said with a smile that he smiles, his radiant smile every day. The young man winced as she copied his smile. She said she was grateful to him for not telling anyone about her work. He turned away in embarrassment and said there was nothing to thank him for. She looked at him intently and said that she still had nothing to give him. She said that the landscape from above, which can be seen from top to bottom, is very beautiful. Elena said that everything would be fine since she used magic. He sighed heavily and said that he was not at all afraid of punishment. She asked with a smile if he could bow his head for a moment. A moment later, the young man obeyed her, and with the speed of lightning, she threw her cloak over him. She said it was very noticeable, so it was better to cover it up. The young lady looked at him with a smile and said that everything was ready. She said it was better to cover everything, including his head. He looked at her closely and wondered if she had always been this small. She said that if they were to rise together using magic, they would need to hold hands. Johann looked at her as if she were providing him with an escort. Closing her eyes, she told him that he should endure it, even if it was stuffy. Moments later, the young lady used her magic. The young man froze in place in surprise. He did not know how he was supposed to describe his feelings now. The young lady turned around as she heard someone calling her. She froze in surprise as she saw her friend again. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she was with a horse today. She said she was told that a groom was needed and it was unofficial. She works as an assistant and studies. He asked in surprise where she would use horse care. She frowned and said that she would use this skill later somehow. She said she could use him as a knight or a mercenary, or in the army. He froze in surprise. The young man looked at her intently and, puzzled, said that this was simply unbelievable. She thanked him with a smile for such words. He froze in shock, knowing it wasn't a compliment at all. He was shocked because he realized that his ideal and gentle picture, which he held for long hours in front of the young lady, instantly evaporated. He understood that when he was around her, he didn't know where the conversation would go. The young lady frowned and said that it looked like his horse was approaching. He looked at her in surprise and asked how she knew it was his horse. Elena said with a smile that the horse looked at him differently. He looked at her intently and winced as she smiled at him radiantly again. He was puzzled because he knew he needed to come to his senses quickly. Todd S. said the girl was taking apart the magnificent legend of his endless victories. He looked at his friend closely and said that he almost burst into tears from how sorry he was. Johann told his friend not to lie. He smiled and said that it was noticeable, and he didn't even know about anything. Todd smiled and said that the young lady had no trouble holding the weapon, and her position was quite good. Johann smiled and said to his friend that he seemed to be watching attentively. He smiled and said that she made Johann swallow the dust after her, and it was hard not to notice. The young man burst into hysterical laughter. Johann was in shock. He had to calmly assess the situation. He looked closely at his friend and asked with a smile if he was interested in the girl. Johann sighed heavily and said that it was all because he had lost to someone for the first time. Todd was shocked as his friend meekly admitted it. He smiled and said that he was not the only one interested in the lady, as she was very beautiful. He asked his friend if he remembered the commotion that arose when she performed in the stands. He said that she was very popular now. Johann S. said that she seemed to be very busy. He did not understand why he suddenly had to worry about such things. He looked at his friend and said that everyone had gone crazy. He watched her for a whole week and saw that she was very diligent. She was conspicuous, but at the same time did not stand out from the group. Even though she said she had received permission, she still used magic openly within the academy's walls. Thanks to this, they flew together. He remembered how they held hands. For a moment, the young man froze in confusion. Todd was taken aback and, looking at his friend, asked what was happening to him. He had never seen his friend so embarrassed before. Johann looked at his friend intently and asked what the problem was, but he didn't answer. Todd looked closely at his friend, for he knew that in the calm flow of Johann's life, an unexpected typhoon had been noticed. The young man looked closely at the young woman and asked if she was also going to listen to the lecture. She said that this was exactly the case. Felisa said with a smile that she changed the lecture and met him at the same time. He smiled and said that it was very good and that she seemed to be in a good mood. She told her friend that the professor needed a partner for his lectures. He said, surprised that he didn't know about it. She asked him with a smile if he would be her partner. She is the only daughter of a count who owns a huge gold mine. He didn't know if she considered him her friend. It was better for him to keep his distance from her if possible. So far, he had succeeded in this. He smiled and said that they were against it. The young lady was very happy. She said that when the time comes, she will know who she should choose. He smiled and said that he would be grateful if she did so. Entering the office, he froze at the door as he saw a young lady. He looked at her intently with a smile on his face because he knew he should smile. A moment later, the young man looked away from her, and Elena looked at him in bewilderment. He was surprised because he didn't understand why he suddenly remembered that night. He knew that, perhaps, he would rather not know the reason for as long as possible. The professor looked closely at everyone present and said that he would now tell them their homework. He said it would be an intellectual game that required a group of 2 people, and they would take turns asking each other questions. If everyone makes a mistake once, and the gas is done, the main score will depend on the number of correct answers. He looked at everyone closely and said that the winner would be awarded bonus points. The young man understood that this task was not only a group one, but also a personal one. The more questions they ask each other, the more the main score will rise. Therefore, you cannot ask difficult questions at the beginning. The young lady called out to her friend with a trembling voice. He smiled and said that everything would be fine. He looked at her closely because he knew it would be hard to expect much from her. He knew he would need to prepare well. The professor looked at everyone closely and said that he would now name the partners who would complete the tasks together. Johann Z froze in place in surprise when the professor called his and Elena's names. He looked at the young lady with confusion, as he did not expect such a thing. He saw that their names were called, but she didn't care. The young lady was in shock and shouted to her friend that she would like to talk to the professor and switch classes. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he was very sorry that they couldn't work together. The professor looked intently at everyone present and said that the exchange of pairs was impossible. He smiled and told his friend that if she needed help, she could ask him as much as she wanted. Elena looked intently at the young man and apologized for interfering. She would like to talk to him alone. Velisa looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression and asked if it was obvious that she was talking to Johann now. She said that in that case, she would talk to him later. The young man sighed and said that everything was fine and they could talk now. Velisa was shocked as she did not expect this from her friend. He looked at her intently and asked what she wanted to talk about. Johann knew perfectly well that recently she didn't want to look at him at all, although she shouldn't have even done so. He looked at her intently, wondering why that expression on her face was so familiar to him. Johann had been through this many times before at the academy. He looked at her intently because he understood that she was about to confess to him. Johann looked at her with a joyful smile because he understood that this was exactly it. He knew that people like that sometimes act uninterested in you, ultimately achieving your goal. He thought she had quite a high level of acting because she deceived him. He looked at her intently as he realized that he could refuse the same comments he had been using up until now. He was puzzled and did not know what face he should make now. He did not know what he should say. A moment later, he froze in embarrassment as their gazes met. She looked at him closely and said that it would be good to choose a day and coordinate everything since the professor was going to oversee the teamwork. He froze in place and a moment later looked at her in surprise and asked what she said. She looked at him intently and said that she would like to talk about the group assignment as it would be good to discuss it. She said that she would be very grateful if he would help her with this. He was filled with embarrassment as he realized that he had been mistaken. Elena said that she couldn't lose her scholarship and that he should choose a time that was convenient for him. Elena listed in it the times when she would not be able to meet him. He was surprised since he had not expected anything like this. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that it was a joke, as he had a very strange expression on his face. He was surprised how coldly she always spoke, saying only what she needed, but now she was joking. Elena S. said that she should get a scholarship, and now they need to decide on a time. He said that he could come to the library later since she was working there. She looked at him intently and said that she would be grateful if he did so. But Elena also said that he should not make noise there and should behave quietly. The young man was shocked, as he did not expect to hear something like this from her. She said with a smile that in that case she was leaving, and they would see each other later. He looked after her with a smile on his face. Johann watched the young lady as she said goodbye to him. He thought that the way she waved her hand, she looked beautiful. A moment later, he froze in embarrassment and wondered if he had really gone mad. He sat quietly in the library and wrote in his diary everything about the young lady. He noticed that she smiled often. Previously, he thought that she always had indifferent facial expressions. He wondered if she was selective about people. He waited for her to finish her work. The young man was puzzled and did not understand why he could not concentrate. He thought that the problem was in the place because the sun was too bright and it was impossible for him to concentrate in this environment. Johann decided to move so that he could focus on the main thing. A moment later, he was already sitting in another place. He noticed that the sun was not shining and there was no one bothering him. Unable to bear it any longer, he stood up and went to watch the young lady sideways. Johann was in shock and wondered what he was doing now. A moment later, he froze in place as he keeps a book on the necessity of the rival's existence. A moment later, he opened the book and began to study it carefully. As he read the book, he thought about the young lady. He knew that she had only taken his gold, which could be considered a mistake to some extent. He knew he never had any competition, so he relaxed. The young lady quietly approached him and asked what he was doing. The young man shuddered and closed the book with lightning speed. Elena looked at him intently and asked if he was finished with the exercises. Taken aback, he said that he was still not finished. She said she doesn't know how many parts there will be in the quiz, but they have to decide how they will act. She looked at the young man intently and said that she didn't care and that she could learn the entire textbook. He looked at her closely because he understood that she really could learn everything since she had said earlier that she should get a scholarship. He knew that if they went off on an improvisational tangent, there would be no reason for them to meet. He said that he liked everything, but still it would be nice if they worked together, since in reality, everything might turn out differently. The young lady in turn agreed with him, and they began to discuss all the issues. A moment later, she was diligently studying her textbook. He looked at her closely and noticed that her pen looked incredibly old, and it looked like she had been using it for a long time. Elena S. said that she only had one pen and asked if she could lend him some ink. He said that he didn't need it, and also thanked her. He looked at the young lady intently and wondered why he kept looking at her. He wondered if it was all because he had to keep a close eye on his enemy. At the beginning of the semester, there comes a time when the club throws all its efforts into attracting first-year students. A more important reason is to gain new connections and reputation. Everyone pounced on the young man as they wanted him to join their circle. He knew perfectly well that he might not join at all. He thought for a moment about where he might join. He looked closely at the young lady, who was sitting quietly on the bench and reading a book, as it was very noisy and she did not even look back. He was surprised because he noticed that no one said a word to her about the introduction. Johann knew perfectly well that it wasn't worth his trouble, but he wondered if he should even say a few words to her. A moment later, he froze in place and looked intently at the young lady as he saw the young man approach her. The lady was surprised that Venture Sam came in person. She said that he was the president of the circle for making magical materials. The young man frowned for a moment and thought as he had heard about the concrete mug. For some time, he looked intently at the young people who were very animatedly discussing the circle. He understood perfectly well that no one was going there, and if they couldn't maintain a certain number of participants, they would have to close. Johann understood perfectly well that the young lady was very busy with work, so she would not have time for the club. He looked at the young man intently, because he knew that he was surprised and that he would not be able to convince her. A moment later, he froze, looking at the young people, as he noticed that she offered him her hand. He froze in shock and wondered what he had seen. After some time, a fierce race began in which each club tried to acquire the newcomer. Once Isaac graduates from the academy, Johann will be the only link that will allow him to gain a connection with House Pertan. However, the club that the young man's gaze was directed towards was located far from the general chaos. He stood quietly by the door while everyone stared at him. He remembered the young lady and how she didn't seem like the type of person who wanted to spend time on club activities. He wasn't sure, but he thought that perhaps she had entered there due to some circumstances. He saw that young people had come, the famous admirers of the magician's activities, Emily and her brother Venture. They had a cruel speech. They were famous for their unusual character. If they had not come from a well-known family of academics in scientific magic circles, no one would have dared to approach them. Johann wondered if they would also make him an offer to join the club. He looked closely at the young people as he was prepared for them to call him. But a moment later, he noticed that the young people had simply walked past him. He froze in shock, as he didn't understand why they just walked past without saying anything to him. The young men slowly entered the office. The young lady greeted them with a smile. She looked closely at the young man and asked if he had been able to find more people. Venture exhaled heavily and said that there was no one who was interested. Mark looked at his friend and said that, basically, there is no one who would be interested in this club. Elena said that if there weren't 6 people in the club, it would close Venture. Es said that, thanks to her, they only had to find one person. Mark looked at his friend and asked if he wanted to thank him. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she could thank him. Mark looked at the young lady and said that he never expected anyone to fall for Venture's bait. The young lady knew that this was a chance to learn something that would help her in the future, without spending extra money. Rita glanced sideways at the door as she didn't understand why it was so noisy outside. The young man exhaled heavily and said that it was all because of Johann. The young lady was delighted and said that she needed to go and look at him. Winter said that it looked like the young man was now outside the door. He understood perfectly well that the young man was not even interested in their club. He did not want to waste his time on him. Rita looked at him intently and said that he should have asked him, because if he joined them, they would get money. The expenditure of personal funds by members on club activities must not exceed a certain limit. The club had many members, which is why their budget was constantly replenished with fees for joining and staying there. She looked at Elena and asked if she had spoken to Johann personally. She said that he congratulated her once, and she thanked him. Rita asked in surprise, was that all? Mark looked closely at the young lady. He noticed that she had the energy of the Dot Millers from their conversation. She said that they should now work as a couple. Rita smiled and congratulated him, and also said that she could ask if he wanted to join their club. The young lady said that she would definitely ask, and she also said that she had already submitted an application to join. The young lady wished the professor would come more often, as she had a lot to learn from him. A moment later, she froze in place as she saw her friend in the distance. She slowly walked up to him and greeted him. He looked at her in surprise as he did not expect to see her. She thought about it because she wanted to quickly ask him and get a refusal to join while no one was around. Elena looked at him intently and asked if he wanted to join the magic materials making club. The young man froze in surprise as he did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at him intently as she expected him to refuse. She knew that, for her, this option was very good, but for him, it was not. Elena said she thought she understood his answer. She didn't have time to finish, and he said he would like to join. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected this at all. He looked at her intently and said that he would like to join the club she was now talking about. Johann, he said that he would come there tomorrow. The lady said that everything worked out well, but she did not understand why he agreed. She looked at him intently and said that he could join any other club much better than them. The young man hesitated, not knowing what to answer to her question. A moment later, he said that it was because he would be able to see the professor often. He realized that he couldn't say it. He wondered if there really were people who wanted to see the professor often. She smiled and asked if he also wanted to go there for the same reason. He was surprised, as he did not expect to hear something like that from her. She said that she should try harder. Being around him would be hard to protect her place. She smiled and said goodbye to him. Johann Z stood frozen in place and wondered whether he had been lucky or not. Mark! It was hard to insert. He didn't know what he was doing in the library at the very beginning of the semester. He knew that he had to fulfill the request of a man who hated to be indebted. Of course, he had to fulfill it to the best of his ability. He told his friend that before meeting the professor in charge of their club, it would be better to learn at least something. He slowly took off his glasses and sighed heavily because he knew that he had no choice. A moment later, the ladies looked at him intently, admiring his beauty. They were surprised as they did not expect to see such a handsome young man. They wondered if there were such people in their academy. Mark, in turn, was very irritated as he was tired of everyone. He was furious because he didn't care about any of the clubs, and he still had to study. He knew that, of course, it was his choice, but he still felt uneasy. He was furious and irritated by everything. The young lady slowly walked up to him and looked at him intently. He started and turned around to see a young lady. She looked at him intently and greeted him coldly. He looked at her intently, as if he knew that she was a very strange fish that had fallen for the hook of the wily venture. He knew that she had overtaken the most popular young man, taking first place, and for some time becoming the most discussed topic in the academy. He asked in surprise if she had worked in the library before. Since this was the first time he had seen her, she sighed heavily and said that this was the first time she had been assigned to work in this section. He looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, silence reigned between them. He looked at her intently, because he knew that she was a perfect match for his friend. If the subject of conversation is not interesting to her, then you will expect forgiveness from her. He was puzzled, because he realized that he was in the same club with two dot millers. So there was another person there who looked very much like a dot miller. Mark knew that he was in a company in which the concept of fun was clearly superfluous. He looked at her closely and asked how everything went with her friend, as Rita had a rather anticipatory look. She looked at him intently and said that Johann S. said that he wanted to join their club. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect the young man to agree at all. He said that it was very unexpected. She smiled and said that it was so. Mark looked closely at the young lady and said that he had received a genealogical book last year. He asked if she needed it by any chance. The young lady looked at him with a smile and said that she really needed it. He froze in surprise as he saw her radiant smile for the first time. He asked if this was really, so Mark said that in that case he would give her the book. The young lady thanked him with a smile. He looked at her intently, as she had recently spoken, rather dryly, answering his questions, as clearly as if she were reading a report. He looked away from her with a smile and thought that she was a very funny girl. He asked if she would go to the clubroom later. She smiled and said she would. He said they could go together. Johann sat quietly in the magic materials, making clubroom, and waited for the steel team members. The young lady looked at him intently and said in a Suez voice that it was very unexpected that he actually agreed to join their club. Rita looked closely at her friend and asked if he didn't think it was blindingly bright in this room today. He sighed heavily, and looking away, said that he didn't know about the room, but looking at her joy could make one go blind. Fincher looked coldly at Johann and said that he could not think that a person like him would agree to join them. He said that it seemed that this decision was difficult for him. Johann, with a smile, said that this was not at all the case, since he had long been interested in the area of their club. Winchervie sighed and said that if that was the case, then they were very lucky since they were on the verge of closing. Rita looked at the young man in surprise and asked about how he closed. She said that soon people will be besieging their club, burning with the desire to join them. He sighed heavily and, looking at the young man, said that they would not be able to accept everyone, and they would only accept those who would fit their team atmosphere. Johann understood perfectly well that since he had joined the club, he needed to maintain good relations with everyone. He froze for a moment and wondered when the young lady would arrive, as he knew that the library shift should have ended by now. Mark looked closely at the young lady and asked when it would be best to give her the genealogical book. Elena said, with a smile, that she would accept it at any time with great gratitude, but the sooner the better. Rita looked at the young people with a smile, as she did not expect them to come together. Johann looked intently at the young people, who were engaged in a casual conversation. He was shocked and did not understand why they came together. He looked closely at the young man, as he was very important. He could not even imagine that he would meet him in a small closed club. Mark Fils Rivian II, the son of a marquis, who held the position of Lord Chancellor of the Empire. Johann knew that in a normal situation, they would undoubtedly be able to get along without any problems, and perhaps even become good friends. But the problem was that their families had a rather strained relationship. Since his father was a duke, commander-in-chief of the Imperial Knightly Order, he, like the Marquis, was one of those who had the right to make decisions on a state scale, and almost always their opinions differed from each other. In addition, his father was a member of the imperial family with the right to inherit the throne, and he also had great power, even more than the Marquis, and without a doubt, he could get a post higher than his rival, and as a result, they did not like each other very much. Mark looked intently at the young man and said that he was an Arab acquaintance, even though they had never met. Johann smiled and said that they had never had a good opportunity to meet. Mark said with a smile that they could leave the work of their fathers outside the academy, since such things did not interest him at all. Johann glared at the young man as he was hinting that it was someone else's concern. He smiled and said that he was very glad that he thought so. He looked closely at the young lady, as he did not understand at all why she had returned with Mark. She constantly made him worry about her. The young lady looked at him intently and quietly said that he had come after all. Johann, looking at her embarrassedly, and quietly said that he had told her that he would definitely come. He looked closely at the young people and wondered how they met. He knew that no more than a day had passed since she joined the club, and there were no other points of contact between them. He wondered if such bespectacled men were really her type. He looked closely at the young man, for he knew that, if he were to judge by appearance alone, he was not a man he should fear. It was rumored that the Marquis's eldest son was quite handsome, but he had heard nothing about the second son. For a moment he thought, as he knew without a doubt, that he was an improvement on Mark. But a moment later he froze in place and wondered what he should do next. He was shocked and told himself that it was very strange that he was thinking about something like that. He looked closely at the young lady because he understood that it was she who was the reason for such thoughts. He knew that, unfortunately, she was completely indifferent to him. He was in shock and just going crazy. He just couldn't believe what was happening. Johann sighed heavily as he sat next to his friend. Todd looked at his friend worriedly and asked what happened. Todd looked at his friend with a puzzled expression and asked why he was sitting there with a serious expression on his face. The young man said that nothing of the sort had happened and that he was not serious at all. He looked at his friend closely and said that he did not believe it, as he could see that something had happened after all. Todd smiled and said that he could share with his good friend, and he would listen to him carefully. He looked away from his friend in embarrassment, and after a moment's thought, he said that one man had asked him something. He said that lately he has been feeling strange and worried because he can't find the reason for it. Todd instantly became serious, and looking at his friend asked what was the matter. He asked if there were any health problems. Johann sighed heavily and said that it seemed there were problems. The young man was puzzled because his friend did not answer specifically. He looked at him intently and asked what symptoms he was talking about. He said that his thoughts constantly revolve around one person, and when he sees him, he is able to tear his eyes away from me. Moreover, as soon as their eyes meet, his heart immediately stops. He froze in embarrassment. He didn't know what to do in such a situation. The young man was in shock. He knew that this was very good, since spring had finally come to his heart. He looked closely at his friend, since he knew that they were talking about Elena. He smiled and said that it seemed to be very serious, since he had heard of similar things. Todd asked him if his friend had said that when he looked at that man, everything inside him turned over, and it seemed as if something was rising from within. Johann sighed heavily and said that this was the case. He looked closely at his friend's oil and said with a smile that, as expected, It was just the spirit of competition. He asked if his friend had accidentally lost to someone or encountered something similar. He said that it was most likely a heart problem and he should go to the doctor. Johann sighed heavily and said that they could just drop the subject. Todd looked at his friend with a smile and said that he was just heartless since he would never find another friend who was willing to listen to him. A moment later, he thought about his friend's words, for he knew that he was not such a petty man as to hold a grudge for a missed place. He was skeptical that he could have heart disease. He knew that if it was a competitive spirit, then it would be enough for him to simply hold on to the victory. If it was a heart disease, then it could easily be cured. He knew perfectly well that what he felt when he looked at the young lady was not a spirit of competition at all. He also knew that he had never complained of pain in his heart. He was puzzled and did not know what was happening to him at all. As she was leaving the office after the lecture, Elena froze for a moment as she saw her partner calling her. He looked at her intently and quietly said that he would come to the library to do his homework. She nodded and became arrogant, knowing that they could work during this time. A moment later, he heard someone calling him. Turning around, he saw a young lady and greeted her. She looked at him intently and said that he needed to choose a club by the end of the week. She asked if he had already made up his mind. Johann looked at her intently and said with a smile that he had already looked at several options and had already joined one of them. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if it was true. She wanted to know where he had joined, just as she also wanted to join the club with him. He said that he joined a club for the production of magical materials. She was surprised and did not understand why he joined there. He said that he had recently become very interested in this area. That's why he decided to do this. She said that she needed to think about it. She looked at him intently and said that if he decided to join any other club, he should definitely tell her. He smiled and said that he understood her and promised to do so. She looked at him closely with a smile on her face, as he had promised her. The lady smiled and said that he was very sensitive and caring. She knew that it would be very good if they spent their whole future life together. She looked intently at the young man with a smirk on her face, and she knew that she would do everything to make it, so Valisa knew that he would not refuse her request. Elena looked closely at the young man and said that it was very fortunate that he came after all, since there was no one in the library. He smiled and said that it was not closing time now, so it was easy to guess when it would be best to come. He looked at us in surprise, standing as if he were an ordinary forester, looking from a tree. Johann did not understand why something like this was on the table. He reached for the leaflet to remove it from the table, but the young lady in turn got ahead of him, and looking at the foxes, said that it seemed that her bookmark had fallen out. He froze in shock as he heard that it was her bookmark. A moment later, he looked down at his book, which had a bookmark on it. It was made of pure gold and had his initials personally engraved on it, and it also had the master's seal. He looked at it closely and wondered if it was an unusual bookmark. The young lady looked at him closely and thanked him with a smile for joining the club. She smiled and said that Rita liked him very much. Johann said that he had not done anything special and did not understand what to thank him for. She looked at him closely and said that the club was very good and that it was a good chance for her to learn something new and that she didn't want it to be closed at all, but thanks to him, it had turned out well. A moment later, there was dead silence between them. He looked at her intently because he saw that she was not even looking at him. He knew that usually people were nervous when they were around him. They were embarrassed to look into his face again. However, this time, the one who could not take their eyes off was him. He remembered when he saw the young lady with the young man. He froze because he knew that she was definitely smiling at that moment, but unfortunately, that smile was not for him. He looked intently at the book as she knew he needed to concentrate. Johann V sighed as all his muscles went numb after sitting in that position. He looked closely at his companion as he saw that she was still in the same position as before. He saw that she was able to read a little. He noticed that she did not take notes. He looked closely at the young lady as he saw that she looked incredibly beautiful as she read the book. He smiled and asked if she was enjoying it. The young lady in turn said with admiration that of course she was enjoying reading the book. He was surprised because he didn't understand how she could enjoy a book that was more like Deadly Weapon, since he saw that it was almost 1,000 pages long. She smiled and said that it was very interesting because she could learn things that she would never have experienced on her own, and only through reading could she understand everything. And besides, while reading, she did not need praise nor recognition from others. She smiled and said that she liked that she could get something new. Just having a quiet time. Johan P. looked at the young lady but did not answer. He knew that she always looked indifferent, even when she was doing a bad job. But now he realized that she was actually constantly looking at others, waiting for her actions to be judged again. He looked closely at the young lady and wondered how much of a burden all this work had been on her. He wanted to know how long she had been suffering from it. She looked at him intently and said that she was not at all as outstanding as he was. She was surprised and did not understand how he could remember all this after reading it only once. She smiled and said that his eyes never once returned to the place where they had already been. She smiled and said that it didn't matter to her, but it was still very surprising. Elena breathed a sigh of relief and said that she was very glad that she was able to get into the academy. He froze in shock as he understood perfectly well that he and many people around him considered studying to be something boring. He knew that for him, studying and reading were something he had to do, having no other choice. He never thought that for someone else, these things could be something comparable only to the road to freedom and liberation. Until recently, he thought that not only did she not look like an aristocrat, but she was also odd. Johann was momentarily lost in his thoughts, as he felt ashamed of them. As the weekend began, the students began to hurriedly leave the academy, returning to their homes. The young lady slowly gave the man the fare, only 10 tants. He looked at her sideways and said that she should sit in the back. The young lady, in turn, entered the house with a smile and told her mother that she had returned. Madame smiled and greeted her daughter. She hugged her daughter with a smile. Elena P. looked at her mother and said that she asked her not to overexert herself. Madame smiled and said that she could not sit still when her daughter was home again. She looked closely at her daughter and asked with a smile if she was hungry. She said she had some pie. The young lady looked at her mother with alarm and said that everything was fine, but the madam had already run off in a hurry to treat her daughter. Elena looked askance at the table and saw there the lace that I made for her mother. She thought for a moment, as she knew that it was painful for her to make the lace due to her illness. Madame asked her daughter if she could take the lace to the shop a little later, as she could not make much, but even this would be enough to sell. The young lady looked at her mother intently and became alarmed, saying that she could not continue to put such a heavy load on her hands. Madame smiled and asked her daughter what she was talking about. She said that she had nothing better to do anyway, and that she was doing it just for fun. Elena was very angry. She told her mother that if it weren't for her, she wouldn't even have been able to get into the academy. Madame smiled and told her daughter that it was entirely her merit and she had nothing to do with it. Elena sighed heavily and told her mother that she was the one who suggested that she go there, and it was she who submitted the application, suggesting that she simply try her luck at the entrance exams. She told her mother that it was all thanks to her. The madam looked at her daughter with a smile and said that she already spoke very well. The young lady looked at her mother with an admiring and joyful smile, but did not answer. Sometime later, a young lady came into the shop. Madame looked at the lady and said that it seemed that the Viscountess had decided to do some needlework again. Elena was surprised that Madame immediately identified whose product it was. Madame said that she could not work without knowing whose product it was. The madam looked closely at the young league and said that it could rest a little while. She went to get payment. Eileen thought for a moment, because she knew that the money given was very little. She knew that her mother was almost out of medicine, and calling a doctor to the house would also cost a lot. She was puzzled because she knew that even though she was doing nothing but studying and working, it was not bringing in any more money. She felt like she was pouring water into a bottomless vat. The young lady looked at Elena in surprise, as she did not expect to see her at all. The lady looked at her closely and wondered if she had come to buy an outfit. She looked at her closely, as she did not understand how she could walk around in such clothes. Even though she was a noblewoman who almost never appeared in high society, she thought that this was simply disrespectful to all aristocrats. Although she had to note that the young lady's posture was worthy of praise, Felisa looked at her intently, as she was very puzzled by the fact that she was spending a lot of time with Johann. She did not like it at all. The young lady slowly entered the room, where everyone from the circle was gathered. She entered and suddenly froze at the entrance, taken aback. She looked intently at the young man. Mark sat quietly immersed in his thoughts, not noticing anything. The young lady looked closely at the young man. She was surprised and did not know who he was. She thought that most likely he was new. She heard that because of her friend. The number of people wanting to join their club had increased greatly. She sat down opposite the young man and looked at him intently. Elena wondered when Mark would arrive. She knew that he should have already been at the club. If she had known that he would arrive later, she would have taken something to read with her. A moment later, the young man noticed that she had already arrived and was slowly putting on her glasses. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected to see something like this. He looked at her intently and said that he expected more surprise from a man who did not recognize the one with whom he was a member of the same club. The young lady asked his forgiveness and said that sometimes she was not very quick-witted. He looked at her in bewilderment. He wondered if she wouldn't even say anything about his face. He knew that everyone had said before that glasses didn't suit him, or that he looked better without them. All the people were looking at him intently and discussing his style. They were saying that all the brothers in his family were just wonderful, but he really looked better without glasses. He was puzzled because he didn't wear them, because he wanted to. The moments when someone secretly compared him to his older brother radically changed his attitude towards such people. The young lady looked at the young man closely and told him not to think anything unnecessary, but she still asked if she could try on his glasses. He froze in surprise, as he had not expected to hear something like that at all. He was surprised because he saw that she was interested in his glasses and not in him. A moment later, he finally offered her the glasses. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she looked interesting. Elena said with a smile that it was simply amazing. A moment later, he handed her the promised book. The young lady thanked him with a smile and said that she would try to return it not too late. Mark said that this should not be done, since he did not need the book. She could keep it for herself or throw it away when she read it. She looked closely at the book. A moment later, the young lady asked him if she could sell it. Mark looked at her in surprise, as he had not expected to hear such a thing. He said that she could do as she wished, since it was no longer his business. He sighed heavily as he realized that she was a very strange person. A moment later, Johann entered their office. He in turn froze in place at the door and looked at those present in surprise. He was puzzled and did not understand why he saw them together again. He knew that the first time it was an accident, but the second time it already raised suspicions and questions. He looked closely at the young people and greeted them with a smile. Mark in turn looked coldly at the young man and asked what was the matter. Johann heard him asking why he had come here, as he had no business. He smiled and said that he had dropped in because he wanted to check something with Vincher. He said with a smile that it seemed he had come at the wrong time. Mark said that the young man had a meeting with a professor today, so he would be a little late. Johann sighed heavily and said that he understood everything. Mark looked at the young man and said that he could wait for him. He said that they had already resolved all their issues and could vacate the room. Johann smiled and said that there was no need for that, and he could come by later. He was a little puzzled by the young man's words. Johann looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if she was free now. She said that she needed to go and have lunch and asked if he needed her urgently. He smiled and said that he wanted to discuss something about his homework and said that they could go and have lunch together. The young lady agreed with him. Johann looked at Mark intently and said with a smile that in that case they would already go. Mark looked at the young man in surprise and bewilderment as he looked at him briefly with a grin. He did not understand why he grinned, as he felt some kind of irritation and a bad feeling. As Johann walked down the corridor, he stared at the young lady. He noticed that her purple hair was very beautiful, and it was also very sparse, and the color suited her very well. He thought for a moment. As he knew that her eyes were the same shade, he looked at her closely and said that he had the feeling that she and Mark had known each other before. The young lady turned around in bewilderment and looked at him intently. He looked intently into her eyes, for he saw that they were the color of the evening sky, which were framed by a hazy veil. He saw that it was a very mysterious color, which resembled a pond at dawn. He remembered his friend saying that the young lady was very beautiful. He knew his friend said it to make fun of him, but he wanted to point out that she was indeed beautiful. Johann looked at her closely and asked if that wasn't the case. He said that he often sees them together. Elena looked at him in surprise and said that it wasn't the case since she met him after joining the club. He said that he would give her a genealogy book for history class, so they met today. She smiled and said that she didn't know many people here, so she thought why not chat with him. She said that it was nice since she got the book for free. Johann looked closely at the young lady and agreed with her, for he knew that she would not have been able to get a genealogical book anywhere since she had no acquaintances or friends at the academy. But he knew that instead of the young man, he could lend her the book. He thought he could ask his brother for a favor once. But a moment later, he was taken aback and wondered why he was even thinking about such a thing. He knew that she had stolen his place. He did not want to admit it, but for him, she was a rival who had won their confrontation. He was furious because he did not know what kind of person in his right mind would help his rival. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked with a smile if he was coming. He looked closely at the young lady, as he knew that for Togo to speak of her as a rival, he had to take into account that their starting lines were too different from each other. He knew that as time went on, the gap between them had narrowed, and he was leaving her far behind. He knew that those who were concerned not only about their studies, but also about their position outside the academy gates, could make useful contacts in the future. Johann looked closely at the young lady and called her. He smiled and said that she could tell him if she needed anything such as a family tree book. Johann said that he already had a couple of acquaintances who had already graduated from the academy. The young lady was taken aback and, looking at him intently, said that she would be very grateful, but she also asked if it was possible. He smiled his beaming smile and said that, of course, it was possible. He was pleased with himself because he knew that he was a very generous person. He knew that even if he helped her now, he would still be the one who would laugh last. The young lady looked at him intently and thanked him with a smile for his help. A moment later, she said that they should go as they were already late. Johann froze in place with embarrassment as she touched him so lightly. He thought for a moment that he should still visit a doctor. Johann sat in the office perplexed as he read the report on the examination results. No obvious abnormalities were found in him, and everything looked like simple overwork. No symptoms were found to suggest heart disease, and no signs of this were found either. He wondered for a moment what the likelihood was that the duchy's family doctor was a charlatan. He decided to stop thinking about it as he saw that he was becoming simply pathetic. He knew it was not a heart disease, and there was no smell of the spirit of competition either. He knew that when he looked at the young lady, he felt an inexorable beating of the heart, an internal trembling, even from the lightest touch, and he was also puzzled by the fact that these inexplicable feelings were connected with only one person. Johann was in shock and knew that he had to stop, as he had nothing to gain by giving his heart to the young lady. He knew that it was quite the opposite, as he had a lot to lose. Being one of the sons of the House of Purton, he received many advantages. Even if he said that he was born with a golden spoon in his cradle, he would not be exaggerating much if he said so. But unfortunately, he knew that he was only number 3, and his older brothers were ahead of him. Even if he could not inherit any of the territories controlled by his father, he would become a viscount, whose life certainly could not be called poor. But unfortunately, he was never able to be born in the first ranks. His father, who won the struggle with his brothers for power, wanted to ensure that the mistakes made by his generation were not repeated again. He understood perfectly well that each number must correspond to its place, and it must live forever, imprinting these words in his heart. The young man was very puzzled, as he had been coping well with everything up to now. He knew that all he had to do was be prepared for what was to come in the near future. He knew that for this reason, he had to keep near him people who could be his strength, a lady from a county that possessed great gold mines, and a young man who was widely known for his connections in trade. He understood that even if he retreated from the glory of his house, he still had to shine at the expense of others. Johann knew that the young lady had nothing to do with any of this. Despite the fact that she was born into a viscount's family, her father had no position or rank, and her family was not famous for anything special. He knew that his father, who possessed a truly noble pride, would not fertilize such a relationship. He understood perfectly well that for this reason he had to get rid of such feelings before they grew into something more. Johann was puzzled as he understood that this was simply unrequited love. He was glad that the young lady in turn did not have any similar feelings for him. Johann knew that for this reason he had to deal with it himself. He knew that hiding his feelings was not that difficult. He was very sad because he knew that there was nothing left for him to do. After realizing his feelings, he decided to avoid the young lady as much as possible. Only in the process he realized something, since their meetings were not accidental. All his seemingly unintentional encounters with the young lady were in fact the result of his unconscious pursuit. He knew that, first of all, it was foolish to think that it was possible to meet the same person so often over such a vast territory. The young lady came to him in a hurry and asked him to help her out, as she was puzzled by the fact that her task partner liked to ask ridiculous questions. She looked at him intently and said excitedly that her partner had recently asked what was written in the last line on the last page. She was shocked because she did not know the answer. The young lady looked at him intently and asked if he knew the answer. Johann thought for a moment, but did not answer. He remembered how he and Eileen Zede had been studying late in the evening, and she had also asked him for similar information. He had clearly answered her question. A moment later, he asked if the professor hadn't said that such questions would not work. The young lady said with a smile that he had said that, and she knew about it, but for some reason she thought that he knew the answer to the question asked. Johann looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that he did not know since the question was so complicated. Before Will, she asked if he also did not know this, and thought the same as she did. The young lady breathed a sigh of relief. He looked away from the young lady in embarrassment, as he knew that all week he had been trying to distance himself from Elena, to think less about her, but unfortunately, everything reminded him of the young lady. Sometime later, the professor, looking at everyone present, said that the next couple to come to the podium would be Johann and Elena. The young men slowly walked up to the podium. Elena looked at him and asked if he was ready to begin. Johann looked at her intently, as he knew perfectly well that he had been avoiding her lately, but now they were forced to come face to face. He looked at her with a smile and said that he was ready, and he also wished good luck to both of them. Unfortunately, this was the last time they communicated so closely. After the lecture, everyone was talking about the young people, as they were shocked just by listening to them. They were surprised as they knew that if the professor had not stopped them, they would have continued answering each other's questions. Johann sighed heavily as it was all over. He thought it was very strange, as he knew he would feel better once it was all over, but unfortunately, it wasn't like that. He was puzzled and didn't know where this uncertainty came from. He knew that all he had to do was decide on his activities in the club, and during his joint lessons, he would have as little contact with the young lady as possible. A moment later, he looked intently at the young lady as he heard her calling him. Elena Yu smiled at him radiantly and quietly said that he was a good boy. Johann froze in place in surprise. He was puzzled because he already knew that he had made his decision and should not fall for her like a complete fool. He looked closely at her beautiful smile and realized that he was just a complete idiot. He knew it was naive to think that he could easily get rid of his feelings. He was in shock as he was trembling just from one look at her. He knew that his strategy was not right from the start. He sighed heavily and realized that while he could follow his heart, he wanted to think about why he really liked the young lady. Johann understood perfectly well that here and now he was just like in a war, and he needed to first study the enemy and at the same time understand himself. He knew that in this case, victory was guaranteed to him. Johann remembered that the lady was working in the stables today. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not expect to see him at all. She looked at him in surprise and asked how he came to see her. He smiled and said that he came to visit his horse. Elena stroked the gentle horse with a smile and said that he was very lucky. The young man froze in place with embarrassment. He did not understand why she said something like that. Johann wondered if she was jealous of the horse, because of the fact that he came to visit him, made him wonder if she wanted him to visit her too. He sighed heavily, as he did not understand what thoughts were swirling in his head. She looked intently at the young man and said that the horse needed to be fed. He looked at her with a smile and said that she could leave it to him. The young lady looked at him intently and said with a radiant smile that he would help her a lot. He froze in embarrassment as he saw her beautiful smile again. She was surprised, looked at him, and asked if he was okay. The young man, taken aback, said that he was okay. He looked closely at the young lady as he knew that she had been smiling a lot lately. He wondered if she had become comfortable with him. Todd greeted his friend with a radiant smile. He smiled and told his friend that he could tell him something that was clouding his thoughts. The young man sighed heavily and said that he was fine. Todd looked at his friend and said that he understood him. Johann knew perfectly well that his friend must never know about his unrequited love. He smiled and said Johann well, so that he knows that he is always ready to listen to him. Johann was puzzled because he knew that his friend liked to joke about him, and he could also let it slip. Johann unconsciously wrote the young lady's name on the paper. He looked closely at his pen and remembered that the young lady always wrote with a real pen. He knew that no one used them these days. He was in shock as he wondered why he cared. He sighed heavily as he knew that his thoughts now were not surprising considering his love fever. He realized that things were getting much worse than he thought. He slowly wrote down all the qualities of the young lady and wondered why he liked her. He thought that she was not his ideal type. He wondered what kind of ideal he wanted to see next to him. For a moment, he thought and realized that compared to the other students, the young lady was very tall. A moment later, he decided to give up on height after all, as he realized that height didn't matter much in a relationship. He hadn't thought about it before, but now he realized that he was attracted to girls with an innocent expression and pale skin. He realized that the young lady fit exactly these criteria. But a moment later, he crossed beauty off the list, because he knew that the face is not the most important thing in a girl. He skipped intelligence and thought about the young lady's family. He realized that they had a very big difference in status. For a moment he drooped, knowing it was not the young lady's fault. He knew that she was born into this family, not because she wanted to. Just like him, he knew that this criterion would not fit. A moment later, he was already happy, because he saw that he had written down all his preferences and realized that the young lady completely corresponded to his ideal type. He froze in embarrassment. Johann was puzzled and did not know how to act in this situation. The professor was giving them a new lecture, while Johann was lost in his thoughts. He wanted to explore the reason for his crush. He knew perfectly well that by learning why he had begun to like her, he would understand how to cope. He looked at the young lady intently, for he knew that no matter how he looked at her, she was beautiful, and he could not argue with that. He frowned and looked at her as if something was wrong here. Johann understood perfectly well that no matter how you look at it, he himself was very good in all aspects of appearance, especially without which he was sure his future in the empire was secured. He understood perfectly well that there were many beautiful girls around, and he could not fall in love with her just because of her pretty face. A moment later, the young lady turned around and looked intently at Johann. He in turn flinched, as he did not expect her to look at him. She quietly asked if he wanted something from her. Johann stood there embarrassed. But a moment later, he quietly told her that he didn't want anything. The young lady in turn looked at him with a soft smile. He was confused by such a change. He was shocked because he realized that now, when their eyes met, she began to smile at him first. He thought and wondered why he started to like her. He wondered if it was all because she was extravagant. He understood that she was really different from others in many ways, but that was not enough to fall in love with her. He wondered if it was because she wasn't interested in him. The young man quickly walked up to his friend and asked him with a smile why he was sighing so heavily. He patted him on the back with a smile and asked what was wrong. He looked closely at his friend and said with a beaming smile that they could think about it together, as he was very worried about him. Johann looked closely at his friend because he knew very well that if he was really worried about him, he might have shared his feelings with him, but he saw that his friend was clearly interested in this matter because he wanted to make fun of him. Todd was taken aback, and looking at Johann asked where he was going to go. Todd said that he was very curious why he was so excited. Johann said that he would like to take a little walk. Some time later, the young man approached the statue. He looked at it intently. He knew that Fiona was a goddess who considered love and affection to be the highest values. It was said that she could make the love of anyone who took her hand and asked for it come true. He slowly walked up to the statue and extended his hand. Johann had always considered it a simple legend. He didn't understand why it came to his mind now. He looked closely at the statue of the goddess and wondered what love was. He was puzzled because he realized that love had made him go through many difficulties. Johann looked into the distance with a smile because he knew that she would not answer him. Unfortunately, he did not know what love was, but for now, he understood one thing: love drives a person crazy. He froze in place and broke into a smile as he thought it was very surprising, since it was only the sounds of footsteps, but he could already determine that a young lady was approaching him. Elena slowly approached the young man and called him. She was surprised to see him at such a late hour. She looked at him in surprise and said that she did not expect to see him here. The young lady asked if he had really gone out for a walk. Johann looked at the young lady with a smile on his face. He knew he was just a fool. She looked at him closely and said that he looked worried. He looked at the young lady with sadness because he knew that he was just a fool who did not know why he fell in love with her. He could not cope with his own feelings, and he could not even understand himself. The young lady looked at him intently and said with a smile that she had already finished her work, so she had to leave. He did not say anything to her, but only stared after her. Johann sighed heavily as he knew that most likely the goddess of love was looking down at him and laughing. He assumed that she simply thought that he was a pathetic fool who simply stood and stared at her. A moment later, he looked at the young lady in surprise. Johann was a little puzzled as she was already leaving him, but suddenly returned. Elena looked at him intently and asked if he wanted to look at the night sky. He froze in surprise and asked why she had returned to him. The young lady thought for a moment, but a few minutes later, she said that she seemed to enjoy meddling in other people's affairs. He hesitated and a moment later said that she was not interested in others. She looked at him with a smile and asked if he had noticed. She said it was very annoying. Johann looked closely at the young lady. He wondered who said that she was cold. He was surprised and puzzled at the same time as he saw that she had a very warm smile. She smiled and said that in any case, he could consider her a friend. Johann looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that. The young lady said that if he didn't want to, she wouldn't insist. He looked at her with a soft smile, as if he knew that he was very happy about this, but was still against it. He knew that becoming one of her few friends was very inspiring, but at the same time, he did not want to fall under the definition of a simple friend. He looked at the young lady. It seemed, now he understood why he liked her very much. He knew that she had shown him how unpredictable fate was, and how unexpectedly love could burst into ordinary everyday life. She looked at him intently and asked him with a smile what he had decided. Johann smiled and said that he agreed. A moment later, the young lady used her magic. Until now, he had been following the intended but undesirable path. He looked at the young lady with a soft smile, as he knew that from now on it would be up to him to decide what he needed to do. He knew that even if the goddess was not on his side, he would continue on the path to the future he would choose for himself. He was a little confused because he admitted his unrequited love, but unfortunately, nothing changed in his life. Johann was a little worried and confused. He didn't know if he could maintain a friendly relationship with her when he had such feelings for her. He knew that being friends was not an option, but he didn't want to suffer from unrequited love either. His attempt to throw off love was interrupted. He was puzzled, as he had only one thing left to do. He knew that he had to make the young lady fall in love with him. Johann stood in the audience, looking absolutely beautiful, and everyone was looking at him intently, as he was simply more radiant than the sun. He looked intently at the door, as he knew that the young lady would soon come to the auditorium. Meanwhile, all the ladies were looking at him intently with admiration. He thought for a moment, because he knew she never caught him at his best. He wondered how stupid he looked. He knew that everything could be easily fixed, since he had prepared more thoroughly than usual this morning. A few minutes later, he saw a young lady come into the classroom. He looked at her with a radiant smile and greeted her. The young lady looked at him in surprise, but still greeted him with a smile in return. Everyone present looked intently and with admiration at his beautiful smile. Elena, in turn, slowly went to her place. Johann was surprised, since they did not even exchange words. He didn't understand how she could be so unperturbed when his heart was beating so hard, it was beating out of his chest. The next day, he stood in the corridor as he was waiting for the young lady. He knew that she came to the academy at dawn, and this was the most suitable time for a private meeting. He wanted to wait for her in the coolest pose. He looked at the young lady intently and greeted her with a smile. Johann smiled and said that she had come very early. She looked at him in surprise and said that he had also come early. She looked at him intently and in her most calm voice asked if he would move away a little. The young man was taken aback and moved away. He had not expected anything like that. Elena P. thanked him and went on about her business. The young man persistently continued to pursue the young lady. A few days later, they met again, and he said with a smile that she looked like him and that she had come very early today. She froze in surprise as he shone brighter than the sun. She sighed heavily and said that he was blinding her eyes. Johann, puzzled, asked for forgiveness. After a week, he put all his thoughts aside, as he was puzzled by the fact that he could learn even a huge history book in a day. But as soon as it came to the young lady, his head went blank. He was shocked and wondered what he had expected, relying only on appearances. Johann understood that at this rate, he would not only not seduce the young lady, but until the graduation, they would consider each other just friends. As a born aristocrat and heir, he was well educated, but he knew that he could unfortunately apply virtually none of this knowledge. He understood perfectly well that if he didn't know something, then all he could do was teach it, as he had done until now. Todd P. woke up late at night. He slowly got out of bed and noticed that his friend was sitting and reading something. He looked at his friend in surprise as he sat and studied late at night. He was shocked and told himself that this simply could not be, since he himself had told him that one must study gradually, and not on the last night, since this was harmful to one's health. Todd was a little surprised and puzzled because he knew that his friend had been studying hard for several days in a row and did not even allow anyone to approach him. Todd understood perfectly well that this behavior was not typical of his friend. He was puzzled and did not know what had happened to him. He sighed heavily because he knew that it was better for him to sleep now, and in the morning he would ask him about everything. But sometime later he woke up again. He looked at his friend in surprise. Since he had recently spoken about the harm to health, he was surprised since his friend was still reading, maintaining the same positions. He looked closely at Johann, as it seemed to him that his hand was not moving. He looked at him with a smirk and decided to approach. Todd looked closely at his friend, who was sleeping quietly. He was surprised as the incomparable Johann slept sitting up. He looked at his friend with a sly smile, as he knew that such a sight was often not seen. He looked closely at his friend and, gesturing near his face, realized that he was completely immersed in dreamland. A moment later, he picked up the book his friend had been studying so carefully, for he wanted to see what was written there. He looked at the book in surprise as it described everything about love in several stages. Todd looked at his mother with excitement and asked when they would go. He said that he didn't like it here because it was too boring. Madame looked at her son and said that now he should come to this place more often and he should get used to it. The man looked closely at his wife and said that their son was already 7 and he and the third son of the Duke's family were just the same age and could send him as a playmate. He was a little puzzled and didn't know what his father's words meant. He knew that if he was a friend, he was just a friend and not some kind of person for entertainment. He didn't understand how and what one could play in such a place. He thought that it would be more interesting outside than inside. But a moment later, he froze in surprise as he saw his new friend. Johann looked at the young man with a beautiful smile and greeted him. Todd looked at Johann intently and wondered if he was an angel incarnate. He knew that as soon as they became friends, he would immediately ask him to touch his hair. From then on, he began to visit the duchy frequently. He looked at Johann with surprise and confusion and asked if he would also be reading books today. Johann, without taking his eyes off the book, said that this was true and he was trying to read faster in order to move on to the next one. He said that he could not lag behind his brothers. He looked at Johann intently as he knew that he was completely mistaken about him, as he was not an angel but a young duke. He looked at him intently and asked when he would finish. Johann looked at his friend with a smile and said that he thought he would finish soon. After that, he would have to go to class. He smiled and told his friend that if he was bored, he could sit down and eat some sweets with him. The life of a young boy was one continuous routine, consisting of boring schedules. He was obliged to study so much despite the difficulties. However, he coped with everything without complaint. He was a handsome, obedient, and exemplary son of a duke. Everyone recognized him. Every time he saw Johann, he felt admiration and at the same time irritation. And at the same time, he felt very sorry for him. Todd thought for a moment that if being a noble young master meant such extremes, then he didn't need it at all. He saw before him an angelically beautiful young gentleman, but he knew that his friend was more like a well-made doll. That's what he thought until now, but now he saw that his friend was also a person with emotions. He noticed that he had read about Marriage for Love, A Guide to Unrequited Love, and many other books. The young man in turn could barely contain his laughter. He was surprised because he knew that proud Johann admitted his unrequited love, and at the same time, he read such books. He barely restrained himself because he knew that he could not laugh now. Johann looked at his friend in surprise and asked if he was laughing. He said with tears in his eyes and a smile that he could barely contain himself. A moment later, he was taken aback as he did not expect his friend to wake up. Johann looked closely at his friend and asked if he liked what he saw. The young man hesitated, not knowing what to answer to such a question. A moment later, he noticed one line in his friend's diary. Since his friend thought that the young lady did not like him because he had not read these books, Todd burst out laughing at everything he heard. Johann looked at his friend closely and said with a smile that he had heard enough. Todd N. laughed his fill and asked his friend to wait a bit. He looked closely at Johann and was a little surprised that Johann was very calm in this situation. He looked at Johann intently because he saw that he was not even angry and for this reason, he was very scared. He looked at his friend intently, because he was wondering if he should hit him first. Johann looked at his friend intently and asked if he was finished. Johann asked his friend if he could now ask him to do one of his errands. Todd Z froze in surprise, as he had not expected this at all. Johann looked closely at his friend and said with a smile that he had laughed at him enough. He said that he understood everything perfectly, as they were friends. He looked closely at his friend and asked with a smile if he agreed to help him. Todd Z froze in surprise, as it seemed to him that he was in trouble. Practical swordsmanship is one of the subjects of the Faculty of Knighthood. Despite the complex name, it is a general education subject from a series of easy ones which is intended for first year. Todd was very happy as he was going to the knighthood faculty for him. His friend's request was very simple. The young man looked at him intently and asked if he could watch the sparring. He smiled and said that of course he would watch everything. A moment later, in the distance, he saw a young and beautiful lady. He noticed that she was really striking. He was a little surprised since she was the only girl in the class, and she also had a striking appearance. He looked closely at everyone present since he knew that they couldn't help but look at her. He understood perfectly well that now was not the time to think about this situation, since his friend had not simply asked him, but ordered him to do something. Todd slowly walked up to the young lady and greeted her with a smile and introduced himself. She looked at him in surprise, but also introduced herself. He smiled and asked if she would mind sparring with him. She smiled and said she would. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she should take care of him. Todd didn't take his gaze off the young lady. He didn't understand why his friend fell in love with her. He wondered if it was all because of her looks. He looked at her with a smirk because he realized that it was too easy. He couldn't take his eyes off her and wondered if his friend liked silent girls. He looked at her intently as if he realized that she was not his type at all. A moment later, the young lady struck her first blow. He was surprised because he saw that she was very serious. He noticed that her stance was correct, just like they taught, but he knew that the problem was that she was too correct. Todd looked closely at the young lady and asked if she didn't mind if he could give her a few tips. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he could do it. He was surprised, but a moment later said that of course he would like to recommend something to her. He froze in surprise because he thought that she would refuse him since she is very cool. He looked at her closely and with a gentle smile said that she should first transfer her center of gravity to her supporting leg, and then the force would not be dispersed, and when she lowered the sword, it would help her put more effort into the strike. After his advice, she did everything as he said. The young lady looked at him sideways and asked if she was doing the right thing. He smiled and said that everything was so, and she just grasped it on the fly. Elena looked at him intently and asked with a smile if this was true. The young man froze in surprise as he saw her smile at him with her radiant smile. He froze as if he now understood everything. He looked at her intently, as if he already understood why his friend liked her so much. The young man looked at his friend in surprise, as he had already chosen a name for the cat. He quickly became attached to the cat, although he usually stayed away from unfamiliar animals. Todd used the window as an excuse and sometimes forced the young man to skip classes. The Duke looked closely at his son and asked the butler what kind of animal he was holding. The butler smiled and said that it was an ordinary stray cat, and the young master liked it very much. Johann looked at his friend and said that his cat had been chased away. Todd was shocked. He didn't understand what they had done wrong. He asked his friend if it was all because they had skipped classes a couple of times. Johann looked at his friend intently and told him not to cry. Todd, with tears in his eyes, asked his friend if he wasn't offended. Of course, from the outside it might seem insignificant, but they were both only 10 years old. But Johann's daily routine built a huge wall around him, and the cat was his only way to overcome it. From then on, the young man never went against his father again. The young man looked closely at the young lady, as he noticed that she looked a bit like their abandoned cat, although he knew that if anyone asked how exactly she looked like him, he would not be able to answer. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if something was wrong. Todd looked at her with a smile and asked if she went to history classes. Elena said that she went to those classes. He smiled and said that unfortunately, he was weak in this subject. He said that if she taught him a little, he would help her in fencing. He smiled and asked if she would like to do so. He knew perfectly well that it was true that he was weak in history. The trick was that he had not chosen this subject. She smiled and said that of course she agreed, but she thought it would be difficult to find the time. He smiled and said that since he had proposed to her, he would try to accommodate her. Elena thought for a moment, but still agreed. The young man was very happy because he knew that his mission was accomplished, and he could tell his friend that he had completed the task. He looked closely at the young lady as he wondered if the abandoned cat was okay. He knew that after she disappeared, she and Johann had never spoken. At times, it seemed to him that his friend had completely lost his humanity, a young duke without desires or aspirations, who like a doll conscientiously did what he was told. He was surprised because the young lady had turned this ideal representative of the family into a person with feelings. He wanted his friend to do his best and try not to lose himself again. Some time later, they all gathered at the Magic Materials Making Club. Johann looked closely at the young lady and greeted her with a beaming smile. Elena looked at him in surprise as he had a large box in his hands. She asked in surprise if he had brought it alone. He smiled and said that it was so. Johann said that she had recently said that she needed a genealogical book. He smiled and said that she did not need to worry, as it was not difficult for him at all. She looked at him in surprise as she knew the box looked very heavy. She wondered if he had carried it himself. She looked closely at Johann, as she had not really noticed him, because he had a handsome face, but now she noticed that he was very strong, tall, and had big hands. Johann smiled and said that he didn't know what exactly she needed, so he brought us a selection of several books. He smiled and handed her one of the books and said that she could look at which ones she would find useful. Johann said that he had already arranged for them to be taken to the dormitory so she could put aside the necessary ones and leave them. He said that she most likely would not have been able to carry everything herself. The young lady thanked him in surprise and said that she did not expect such help from him at all. He smiled and said that it was nothing, since he heard that Mark also helped her. He smiled his radiant smile and said that classmates should do the same. The young lady froze and stared at him. After he said that they were classmates, she knew that Johann didn't mean anything like that, but for some reason, his words calmed her down. She felt like she was standing on the very edge of a cliff called the Academy, but Johann seemed to stand next to her and acknowledge her. He smiled and asked her how the book Mark had given her was. He said he was very worried that compared to her, all of this would be oba useful, since there were a lot of old books in the box. The young lady looked at him intently as she realized that he was very kind. He thought for a moment as he knew that these books must be better than the book Mark had given her. Elena S. said that Mark said that he didn't need her anyway. She smiled and said that she wouldn't refuse such a good offer, but of course she took notes on everything. She smiled and said that if he wanted, she could give him the notebook and he could read it. Johann said he had a lot of records at home. His older brothers had put effort into them, so he kept them carefully. Of course it was a complete lie, from a book that was scribbled and tucked away in the corner of the office. And until recently, he didn't know they existed. He didn't understand why genealogical books were needed at all. He smiled and said that he would be very glad if these books were useful to her. He said with a smile that she might not return them, and that he would not mind if she gave them to someone who would also need them. He wanted to try in the future to give her everything that could be converted into money. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he heard that she had decided to take fencing lessons from Todd. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if he knew the young man. Johann smiled and said that of course he knew him since they were longtime friends and roommates. He was a little puzzled since he knew that now his friend who laughed at him had become his obedient slave. She smiled and said that she understood everything, and also said that about the lessons it was true, since in exchange she would teach him history. She smiled and said that she was very lucky because she was not strong in fencing. He said that he was very sorry, but his friend was given an urgent task, so he would not be able to find time. But a moment later, he said with a smile that his friend had offered to replace him. He smiled and said that his friend would be very grateful to her if she accepted his help. Johann knew that the books about love that he had been reading all last week all agreed on one thing. He needed to spend as much time alone as possible. Apart from school hours, the training ground was usually empty, so no one would disturb them. Johann knew that personal training was quite suitable as a reason, so this would be an ideal opportunity. The young lady in turn looked at him intently, with a smile on her face. She thought about this situation. He felt nervous for a moment because he didn't understand why she was looking at him with such distrustful eyes. He wondered if she really doubted him. He was shocked because he understood that she could trust his friend, but not him. The young lady looked at him intently and thanked him for agreeing to take this on. She asked in confusion if this wasn't a waste of his personal time. Johann was taken aback and said that he would be only too happy to help her. A moment later, the young lady said they could try. He froze for a moment as he was not very satisfied with her answer. He was shocked and wondered what she thought of him. He was very ashamed. Mark looked closely at everyone present and said that their composition had already been formed. After the end of the recruitment of new members, the number of people in the club was 6 people. Rita smiled and said that there were many candidates. Vincher looked closely at everyone present and said that he had decided not to accept them because their motives were clearly impure. Mark looked closely at his friend and said that he was simply great. Rita smiled and said that in any case, now there was no need to be afraid of the dissolution of their club. She smiled and said that they would be fine here. She looked closely at Johann and worriedly asked if nothing terrible would happen because he had not joined other clubs. He said that he thought that participating in this club would be much more effective. Vincher, although he knew that for his friend who loved magic but couldn't use it, this was an area where he could put all his love. He was surprised because he knew that he was his only friend, but he thought the appearance of Rita and the new members was even for the better. He looked, but a moment later, he noticed that someone was looking at him intently. He turned his gaze to Johann, who was glaring at him. He was a little surprised, since Johann's eyes were simply burning with rage. Mark looked away from the young man, as he understood that he simply had no reason to hate him. Rita looked at her friend closely and said that they could do something great at this festival. She was excited and said that what they did last year was not enough. He looked at her in surprise and said that with Victoria and me, there were no problems with knowing the materials. She sighed heavily and said that the lack of participants was the main problem. The young lady looked at everyone present in surprise and asked if they were really having a festival. Rita smiled and said that it seemed like the young lady didn't know about it. She said that the Academy Festival is very famous. It is held openly, so it is a rare occasion when they accept people from outside. Emily said that the gates are open these few days, right after exams and right before the holidays. The young lady in turn thought about the festival. Mark looked closely at the lady. He was wondering what was on her mind. He knew perfectly well what was on his friends' minds, but he didn't know about her thoughts. A moment later, he felt Johann's fierce gaze on him. Turning around, he saw that the young man was smiling at him. He was a little puzzled, as he did not understand his change. He looked closely at Johann and wondered if he really wanted to tell him something. But a moment later, Mark looked at the young man with a smirk as he understood why he was staring at him. The next day, the young lady trained hard at the training ground. She wanted to practice a little before Johann came to her. She hit the scarecrow several times. She thought for a moment because everything seemed very strange to her. She did everything exactly as she was taught in class, but each time she hit different places. Unlike studying where you can simply learn and apply the acquired knowledge here, no matter how much you cram, the body will not move as it should. The young lady thought that it was very interesting and entertaining. She wanted to try again. Johann approached the young lady with a smile and said that she was still training. She jumped as she did not expect him to sneak up so suddenly. The young man asked her for forgiveness as he saw that he had frightened her. She was taken aback and said that it was not that simple. She was a little surprised. She looked closely at Johann and asked when he had managed to arrive. He smiled and said that he had just arrived, but he called her, but it seemed that she did not hear. The young lady smiled and said that she was just always focused on her studies and therefore did not notice anything around her. She smiled and said that everything was fine now. She looked closely at the young man because she knew that she was surprised, but did not understand why he was making such a face. Johann smiled and said that the workout clothes suited her very well. She looked at him in surprise and said that she thought they suited him much better. He looked at her in surprise. She looked at him closely and said that the clothes suited him better. Johann froze in place with embarrassment. He looked away in embarrassment and said with a shy smile, "So you might think that she was telling the truth." She was surprised, looked at him, and asked why she should lie. She did not understand why he was so embarrassed, and wondered if this was the first time in his life that he had heard praise. Johann said that they could consider the training clothes to be suitable for both of them. A moment later, he said that they could now begin the classes. She smiled and agreed with him, and also began to stand. The young lady looked at him intently as he looked very serious. Elena thought for a moment, as she thought that he had agreed to help her purely out of pity. Johann looked closely at the young lady and said in all seriousness that she needed to relax her shoulders a little. He said that she would quickly get tired if she held a sword like that. She obediently carried out all his commands. A moment later, he asked if he could borrow her sword for a few minutes. The young lady in turn agreed and slowly handed him the sword. She noticed that his hands looked rough, like those of a man who had recently practiced with a sword. She looked at him intently and asked him in all seriousness when he first picked up a sword. He thought for a moment and said that he didn't remember well, but it was a very long time ago. He just had to learn at some point. She said that she heard that the Duke was the commander-in-chief. He smiled and said that he would have to stop the lesson because his sword skills would look shameful. The young lady said that she didn't mean to compare at all. He looked at her intently and said with a soft smile that he knew, and there was no need to compare anything here. She looked at him closely and wondered if he was uncomfortable with questions about his father. She didn't know for sure, but she thought it was an uncomfortable topic for him. He smiled and said that they could try again. A moment later, he explained to her everything as it should be done, and a few minutes later, he said that he would show her everything in practice. The young lady froze in surprise. She admired him because she saw that even the sound of the blows was the same. He smiled and asked if she wanted to try. She was surprised because she didn't expect that she would have to try everything at once. She looked closely at her tool, knowing that even the professor who had given the lesson in bad faith had demonstrated the movement at least a few times. Moments later, the young lady finally struck. Johann smiled and said that she was just great. She looked away from him and, breathing heavily, said that it was not so. She was a little puzzled, since she did exactly as he showed. Johann, in turn, noticed that she was very worried about the fact that she did not succeed. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that if she didn't mind, he could put her in the desired position himself. She was indifferent, looked at him and said that she didn't mind, and he could do as he wanted. The young man slowly approached her from behind and, asking for forgiveness, looked at her with embarrassment. A moment later, he stepped back from her. With the speed of lightning, he was very embarrassed, and his heart was pounding. The young lady in turn looked at him in bewilderment and called out. Johann said, embarrassed, that he suddenly felt dizzy. Elena looked at him with surprise and excitement and said that they could finish then, but today he shouldn't overwork himself at all. He was taken aback and said that this wasn't true and that he was fine. She looked at him in bewilderment and said that he had turned very red. Johann's nose and said that there was nothing special about it. He just suddenly felt hot and his head was spinning. She looked at her in surprise because she did not understand such a sudden change. A moment later, he asked her forgiveness again. Johann slowly approached the young lady from behind and froze for a moment. He quietly whispered in her ear that he would take the sword in his hands for a short while. She froze for a moment. The young lady was a little puzzled, as she had not paid attention until now, but now she realized that he had become very close. She noticed that he always looked slim, but he turned out to have a very strong build, and the body that touched her back was harder than she thought. Johann said that he would strike. He said that she could watch how he moved the sword and where he put his power. She froze for a moment as his voice was very soft. She froze in surprise as she felt a strange feeling, as if something was tickling her chest. He looked closely at the lady and called her. She was taken aback and threw away all her thoughts. He asked her to relax a little and that he would not succeed at night. The lady asked for forgiveness. A moment later, the young man struck with embarrassment. She looked closely at the scarecrow, as his movement was soft and smooth. She could not believe that it was so natural. She turned around and with a radiant smile thanked him. She said that this example had helped her a lot. She looked at the young man in surprise and asked if everything was okay with him. As she saw that he turned around, the young man was squirming with embarrassment. He said that everything was okay with him. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that now she understood what he was talking about. She smiled and said that apparently it was much easier to do something like this yourself if you tried it yourself. He smiled and asked if she really thought so. Elena said with a smile that it was true, and she also said that next time she would also ask for help. Johann looked at her with a smile and said that if it really helped her, then he was very glad. He came back and said that they could continue training. She looked closely at the young man as she saw that his blows were very accurate. She in turn wondered how much training it took to handle a weapon so well. Jilly looked at the young lady intently and asked if she ever rested at all. Elena was very focused on her work. She casually said that she would rest later. The young lady looked at her neighbor in surprise and asked when she was going to rest later. Elena sighed heavily and said that she would rest when she died. The hated one was in shock. She did not understand how such a thing could be said. Elena looked at the girl and said that she was just joking. Jilly Z froze in surprise on the spot and understood that it was just a joke. She looked closely at her neighbor, as she knew that since their first meeting, she had never seen the lady spend time doing nothing. She had never once caught the moment when the young lady was just sitting idle on the bed, except for the time for sleeping. Jilly Z knew that the lady never started a conversation first. She was always busy with her own affairs. For this reason, she often felt that the young lady did not like her. But Jilly knew that the young lady always had a lot of worries. There was no time, so she was always fussing. Elena looked intently at her neighbor and said that if she was sick, then she should say so, and she would take her to the doctor. Jilly S. said that she was not sick at all, and that was not the point. She just needed to solve this problem. But she did not understand at all how she should do everything correctly. Elena looked closely at the young lady and helped her solve the problem. Jilly knew her neighbor was a very kind friend, with the coldest expression on her face in the world. Jilly looked at her neighbor and said that she didn't need to be such a possibilist. Elena looked at her neighbor in surprise and said that she was quite optimistic. She just needed to finish this work. Jilly looked closely at the young lady and said that she had come from far away, but it seemed that her neighbor was completely indifferent to her. She told her that she might regret it. The young lady apologized to the girl and said that she understood everything, but exams were coming soon, and she had absolutely no time. She looked as she a moment. The girl looked at her with a grin and said that it was so, but she saw that the lady was alone today. Jilly looked at them intently. She knew that they were foreigners compared to her, an aristocrat, and their speech was refined, and there was a sense of nobility in their manners. Their aura of good manners made her feel a little insecure. She smiled and said that her neighbor had a lot of things to do, and that was why she was alone. The young lady smiled and said that then they could spend some time with her. She smiled and asked how she felt about that. Jilly thanked them with a smile, but said that they didn't have to do that at all. She knew that they looked very nice, and she would always be grateful for the invitation, but in her opinion, she was uncomfortable in their company. The girl asked her to speak to her informally, but she herself maintained a formal tone. The girl looked at Jilly intently and asked with a smirk what she was planning to do when she returned to her kingdom. She smiled and asked her if she would share her plans with them. Jilly was puzzled, as the girl kept mentioning her homeland. She understood perfectly well the interest in her as a native of a closed kingdom who arrived at the academy. She was a little excited and could not simply admit that she simply ran away. She could not. The girl, Jilly said with a smile, that she was of course bored, but she couldn't do anything about it. She said that her neighbors had a very hard time combining studies and work. The young lady looked at her in surprise and asked if she really meant to say that Lady Elena works. Jilly, with a smile, said that it was so since she weaves lace. She smiled and said that if someone looked at it, they would be amazed at her skill. She said that her neighbor had also signed a contract with the store. She said with admiration that it was simply amazing. The young ladies were shocked by this. They did not expect to hear such a thing at all. They said that now they understood why she was almost invisible. Jilly Z froze in surprise. She did not understand why the atmosphere suddenly changed. She said that her neighbor was a very busy girl, and that's why she didn't go out. The girl looked at the princess and said that she always thought the lady was just very strange. Jilly said that it was not so simple, that she was busy with things to do. Jilly looked closely at the young girls. She had a bad feeling, which told her that she had made a big mistake. Todd looked at his friend in surprise and asked if he was preening again. He smiled and said, Johann, that he was dazzling, even without it. Johann sighed heavily and told his friend to leave him alone. He said with a satisfied smile that he felt very sorry for Johann, because even on the most beautiful flower, a butterfly does not want to sit. A moment later, a pillow flew at him with a crash. The young man looked at Johann in bewilderment and asked what had happened. Lately, he had been suffering from insomnia. The reason for all this was that he had been seeing dreams about a young lady. He remembered the moment when she stood in his strong arms. He saw her hair gathered up, revealing her long white neck and fragile shoulders. He felt the warmth coming from her body. He smelled her pure scent. He was shocked because he knew he needed to get ready quickly. He didn't understand why she was so calm at that moment, and even asked him for help again. Johann was in shock, as his heart felt like it was about to stop. He knew he couldn't handle another wave of pain. A moment later, He sighed heavily as he realized that if she asked him for help again, he would be happy to help. He sighed heavily because if he had known about this earlier, he would have started dating someone at the academy a long time ago. He knew that inexperience in love is a very scary thing. Jilly looked at the young lady intently and said excitedly that she had not done it on purpose, as she did not know anything at all. The young lady looked at her neighbor intently and said that she understood everything Jilly asked her for forgiveness, as she had let it slip completely by accident. She was worried because she was afraid that her friend would be gossiped about. Elena, in turn, said that everything was fine. She did not show any emotions. The princess looked intently at her friend and asked for forgiveness again. Elena looked at her friend with a gentle smile and said that everything was fine with her and she didn't need to worry. She smiled and said that it would come out one day, if not today, then some other day. She smiled and said that it was nothing special. Elena said that in addition to embroidery, she did various jobs at the academy, and there is already a person who knows about this. She said that perhaps others also know this have not met Johan. She met many students on the way to work. Elena looked at her friend with a smile and said that if the rumor spread, the reason would not be Gili but her. She smiled and said that the princess simply told a small detail about her neighbor's life. She said Elena smiled and said that she did not feel any shame or awkwardness at all. She asked her friend if she knew how many years she had been working. She smiled and said that thanks to this, she bought medicines and materials for her mother. Jilly looked closely at her friend. She wondered who in this situation should console whom. She saw that her friend was a very good and kind person. Jilly looked closely at her friend's hands. She noticed that she had a lot of mausoleum, especially the fingertips were very wounded. Elena asked her friend with a smile if her hands were disgusting. She looked at the young lady intently and said that it was not like that at all. The young man sat quietly and studied the book. Everyone looked at him intently, as it turned out that he often came to the cafe at this time. The young ladies sat quietly near him, whispering and looking intently at him. He read the book with a smile, as if he could hear them perfectly. They were interested in what the young man's book was about. They saw that he was very thoughtful and thought that he was reading a collection of poems. But a moment later, they realized that he was reading philosophy. But in fact, the young man, and was studying a romance novel. He simply changed the cover. He had already reread many works of different genres. He knew that a novel is fiction, but sometimes, even indirectly, it can help in some situation. A moment later, a young man with a smile on his face approached Johan. He looked at Johan intently and asked what he was doing all alone. The young man smiled and asked Johan what he was reading. He wanted to look at the book and its contents. Johan pushed the book towards himself with lightning speed. He smiled and said nothing. The young man looked at his friend in surprise, as he had not expected such a thing. Johan looked at his friend intently, with a beaming smile on his face. The young man froze in bewilderment, not understanding what had just happened. He smiled and said that he had met his girlfriend on the road, and that she seemed to be in a good mood today. He looked closely at Johan and asked if he remembered a girl named Elena. Johan looked at his friend excitedly and asked what she had to do with it. Bach was taken aback and said that he didn't mean anything like that. Johan looked at his friend with fury and told him to get to the point quickly. A moment later, the young man told him everything. Education in the modern world has become a blessing, available only to a select minority of people. This minority was mainly members of noble and royal families. However, this did not guarantee their outstanding abilities. He knew that the son of the marquise, who had gone with the near failure, the son of the count, who had forced a passerby to write an exam for him, there were many peculiar people in the academy. He knew Johann always thought that this order of things had not changed, that in this world there did not exist such unnecessary concepts as justice and impartiality. He was lucky to be born into a noble family, and also with excellent appearance and a phenomenal memory. However, he never considered himself special. On the contrary, he took it for granted and did not even think of giving it up. The young man flew into the auditorium with lightning speed and began to look for the young lady. When he thought of her week before the power of the same chosen ones, his head was ready to explode. He froze in shock when he saw the young lady in all her glory, sitting quietly with an unperturbed look. A moment later, the young lady turned around as she heard someone calling her. The young ladies slowly approached her and looked at her with grins. Elena looked at the girl intently as she addressed her as a daughter of the family and not as a simple classmate. She looked at the girl intently as she realized that the inevitable had finally happened. Elena looked intently at everyone present and said that her name was Elena Evoy. The girl said with a grin that she had recently heard some interesting rumors, and it seemed that she would be very interested in them. Elena looked closely at everyone present and said that they could sit down first, since it would be very difficult to carry on a conversation standing. She smiled and said that there were plenty of empty seats nearby. The young lady in turn slowly pulled out a chair to sit down. A moment later, they were all sitting and looking intently at each other. The girl looked at the lady intently and asked with a smirk if she would like to tell her what happened over the weekend. Felicia smiled and said that she would be happy to tell her everything. She said with a satisfied smile that last weekend she had stopped by one street and gone into a shop. There she saw a young lady who looked very much like Miss Elena. Felisa asked with a grin if Eileen knew him. Belfiore. Elena looked intently at the young lady and said that this was all familiar to her. The young lady in turn did not expect this. She looked at Elena with bewilderment. Elena smiled and said that of course this is how it is. The young lady looked at the girl in bewilderment, as she did not understand why she was so calm in this situation. She smiled and said that at first she didn't suspect anything, but after some thought, something gave her an idea. Felisa said with a grin that she immediately noticed the dull color of the outfit. She did not understand whether it was like that, or it faded due to long wearing. For aristocrats, clothing had a special meaning with its help. They demonstrated their status and observed formalities. After all, wearing whatever came to hand, they were no different from commoners. The young lady, frowning intently, looked at everyone present and said that they were right, since her outfit was indeed very old. The young lady in turn said with a satisfied grin that it was very noticeable. Elena N. looked at those present and said that this outfit was given to her by her mother. For a moment, there was a dead silence in the audience. The young lady looked at him with puzzlement. Felisa sighed heavily and said that she had heard that it had once been in fashion. The young lady looked at them intently and said that it was so, as her mother had also told her that this design was the most popular before they discussed fashion for some time. Elena looked closely at the young lady and said that she had quite a deep knowledge of fashion. Felisa looked at everyone present with a contented smile and with embarrassment. She smiled and said that the girl was right, and it was true. Everyone present began to praise her. The young lady in turn was shocked, since she understood that if the conversation went in another direction, they would become a laughingstock. She looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she was much more interested in another piece of news. She asked Elena if it was true that she worked in a store. They were surprised that the Viscount's daughter worked. For some time they whispered to each other and discussed the fact that she was working, while the young lady sat quietly and listened to them. The lady looked at Elena and screamed as she saw that she did not even pay attention to them. Elena O. opened the book and showed it to everyone present. She smiled and said that she was embarrassed to show this to Felisa since her skills were very modest. The young lady in turn looked at them intently as she wanted to know what was in the book. She was surprised as she saw samples of lace. She thought that the girl was simply a master. Looking at the lace, she felt classic and beautiful. The girl looked at the lady with a grin and said that if she understood everything correctly, then the lady was proud of this. She said that a well-bred aristocrat would be embarrassed by this. She did not understand what the Viscount was thinking, since he allowed her such willfulness. Felisa said with a smirk that this was indeed the case. She did not understand what kind of father would allow such a thing. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and said that her father had died 10 years ago. She said that unfortunately, there had been an accident in which his carriage had overturned. The auditorium immediately became quiet. Usually, the misfortune of a daughter from a noble family is insignificant. A small one is an unexpected exam or a missed dessert in the original quantity, something like that. Words about the life in which the father died seem like something from another world. However, this did not mean that they did not bring sadness. The young lady hesitated. She did not know what to answer to this. A moment later, the girl sadly asked the lady for forgiveness, saying that unfortunately, she had jumped to conclusions. Elena looked closely at everyone present and said that everything was fine. She was more surprised that the girl apologized so calmly. After a while, she invited them to look at her work. They agreed. Felisa said that while they were chatting, she had to make an order. She said that sympathy should be shown with money. A moment later, The young lady turned around as she heard a noise. In the crowd, she saw Johann. She looked at him with a smile as she realized that he had seen everything. The young man greeted his friend with a smile. A moment later, he looked at Johann with bewilderment as he saw that he was very upset. For a while, he called him with a playful smile, but it was all in vain since Johann did not answer. Todd smiled and said that his friend was unrequitedly in love. A moment later, a pillow flew at him. Todd was shocked and did not understand at all why his friend was silent if he heard him. He said with a satisfied smile that his face was eye-catching, unlike Johann's. Johann swung the pillow again, but his friend asked him to calm down and not throw anything else at him. Sometime later, Johann told his friend everything. He was shocked and did not understand why they were pestering the young lady so much. Todd said that perhaps Bach had decided to make a big jackpot by talking about Elena, and the situation was opportune. Johann was a little puzzled, as he knew that the opinion of those around him about the young lady was not the best. Appearing out of nowhere in a closed society, having received first place in the exam, Elena was like an eyesore. Moreover, since she always walked alone with an indifferent face, it was natural that there were guesses that either she was unsociable or ignored others. Johann was a little puzzled because in such a situation he had openly communicated with her, and it was not surprising that all the arrows flew at her. He thought that he should have been more careful. When he ran to her, he thought that she was in big trouble. He was very worried that she could experience something like this, and it could break her. Then he froze at the door when he heard that her father had died. Johann was puzzled. He didn't understand how he could be sure that he could resolve everything. He realized that she always protected herself. As he inserted it, he felt the familiar feeling of shame wash over him again. Then he realized that he would be looking up to her for a very long time. However, he was very embarrassed because he did not understand why she suddenly winked at him. The young man looked at his friend in surprise and asked what was wrong with his face, as it looked very suspicious. Johann was puzzled, as he wanted to see the young lady right now. Todd looked at his friend in surprise and asked why he suddenly blushed so much. He froze in bewilderment, as he did not understand why his friend suddenly jumped up. He in turn ran out of the room with lightning speed. The young man shouted to his friend and called him. He did not understand where he had rushed so suddenly. Some time later, Johann came to the library. He was waiting for the young lady there, but of course she was not there. He came there in the hope of seeing her. He did not know what else he could do in this situation. He sighed heavily, because he knew that he had neither the right nor the slightest reason to meet her. He knew that he was just a classmate to her. He understood perfectly well that they were not made for each other at all. He knew that they had different statuses. But when he was next to the young lady, he felt as if he had faded away. Nothing like this had ever happened to him. He thought it was very funny, since he had always treated others with disdain, looking down on them, and now he was so stupidly fading. He understood that reading books did not give any results, and on the contrary, each time he fell in love with her more and more. He was shocked because he didn't think that he was so incapable of learning. He understood perfectly well that at this rate, even after graduating from the academy, he would constantly follow her. He knew that this wouldn't work, but as soon as he imagined that his feelings would remain unrequited, something in his chest tightened. He knew that, of course, he could be with her forever. He wondered if there was a future where they would be happy together. As soon as he tried to imagine it in his head, a fog appeared. He thought for a moment, because he knew that the young lady should now be working in the garden. He wandered leisurely through the garden and suddenly came across a young lady who was working near a statue. She took off her hood with a smile on her face and called Johann. Johann looked at the young lady intently, but did not answer. He felt as if his selfish desires were fading away, and he was filled with happiness. He slowly approached the young lady, wondering if this was love. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had come to see someone. He sighed heavily and said that it was not so. She smiled and said that he seemed to like night walks. Johann said that was not quite true. He saw that she could not even imagine that he had come to visit her. She smiled and asked if anything was bothering him today. He thought for a moment about what had happened some time ago. A moment later, he remembered the last time he had also come to the statue. Then, he suffered from unrequited love and sought consolation in the girl he was in love with. Looking at the young lady, he thought that this was simply not nonsense. He looked at her with confusion and thanked her for last time. She looked at him with confusion and said that he didn't need to thank her at all. He smiled and said that all the statues were shining. She smiled and said that she hoped that the dean would appreciate her hard work. Johann, clearing his throat, said that someone could tell him how much the garden had been transformed. She smiled and said that in that case, she would pretend that she didn't know it. The young man knew that he simply had to do it. He thought that maybe after this, the dean would give her some kind of bonus. He wanted to win over the dean's niece, who was studying at the academy, to his side. A moment later, he froze in place as he saw the young lady begin to work diligently on the statue. She was always busy with work, but she never tried to drive away another person of her friend. He did not understand how they could say that she was unsociable. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and asked what he was doing. He smiled and reached for the rag. He said with a smile that since he was going to distract her, he thought he could help her a little. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, as she had not expected to hear such a thing at all. Johann smiled and said that he would like to talk to her. The young lady froze for a moment as she saw his face up close. It seemed to her that it was even more perfect. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he wanted to talk about. She smiled and said that she was listening to him attentively. A moment later, she touched him and said that such an occupation was not at all suitable for him. Johann looked at her intently and asked if it really suited her. The young lady leaned towards the statue, but did not answer. He looked at her closely and said that she herself said that she works for money. He asked if she remembered this. He said that he knew that she was not doing this because it suited her. She looked at him intently because she knew that he was absolutely right. She did not know a person who would like to work because it suits him. She felt strange because work was natural for her. She looked at him with a smile and said that she would not object anymore. Johann looked at the young lady with a beaming smile and thanked her. He understood perfectly well that if his friend heard him now, he would laugh at his pretense. He knew that until recently, he hadn't even thought about work seriously. The people around him always had a certain meaning, and he hadn't cared at all, at least not before. When the young lady refused his help, he felt very strange. He looked closely at the young lady and said that unfortunately, he had accidentally seen what had happened during the day. She looked at him calmly and said that she knew about it. He knew that even though they had apologized to her, the girls had still insulted her very badly. And even if they hadn't known anything in their conversation, they had insulted and mentioned her late father. He knew that anyone in such a situation would have gotten angry. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was no big deal since they were just kids. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she was talking as if she were not a child herself. She smiled and said that it seemed so. The young lady said with a soft smile that they were very kind girls, sincere and pure. She looked at her friend sharply and said that if the girls had had bad intentions, she would have lost her sample catalog, as they could easily have torn it up and thrown it somewhere so that she would never have to show it again. She smiled and said that she had done various jobs, even worked as a maid for a short time. Unfortunately, she was also fired from this job, and it did not count towards her length of service. Johann looked at the young lady with bewilderment, as he did not know what to tell her. She smiled and said that he should keep it a secret, as anything can happen in youth. He looked at her intently with a soft smile. He didn't understand why, having learned her secret, he was not at all happy about it. He understood perfectly well that she was from an ordinary Viscount's family, and she and her mother survived without a father. He could not even imagine how many difficulties they had to endure. This would happen someday. She didn't want to avoid a confrontation. Continuing to fake a smile, she said that she thought those girls would do the same if it mattered. She smiled and said that she didn't have time to worry about it. She smiled and said that the girl apologized to her right in the classroom. She said that she was very surprised. Then, since it is not at all easy to apologize. Johann looked at the young lady intently. He was thinking about her words. He knew that this happened because of him, and he also had to ask her for forgiveness. He was puzzled, because at that moment, when she defended herself from the attacks, he stood aside and quietly watched. And now he came to her with belated apologies. He knew that now he could only drown out the voice of conscience. He wanted to save this regret for later. When the time comes, he will not get by with words alone. The young lady slowly rose, and standing on her feet, she thanked him for his help. He sighed heavily and said that perhaps he was of little use. She said that the two of them got it done quickly, and with his help she finished early. He smiled and said that they could work together every day. She smiled and said that there was no need to do that, as she had enough competition for the first place in the ranking. He looked closely at the young lady as he realized that everything was right. He knew that if he got any closer to her, it could cause her problems. A moment later, he realized that they had already returned back. Johann was a little puzzled, because when he walked to her, the road seemed endless to him, but on the way back, time flew by, unnoticed. The young lady looked at him intently and asked if he could wait for her for a little while, as she wanted to bring him something. Elena S. said that if he was in a hurry, of course, then she could give it to him another time. Johann beamed with lightning speed and said that he would of course wait for her. As she was leaving, she smiled and said that he should wait for her here, and she would be back soon. He smiled and said that she could take her time. For a moment, he remembered the book. It said that men who are too simple are not attractive. He knew perfectly well that he would be happy with anything if he got something from her. He was a little confused and puzzled, as he knew that this was the first time he had fallen in love with someone. A moment later, he threw his thoughts away as he heard the young lady calling him. He looked at her sharply and said that she had come back very quickly. She looked at him sharply and said that it was not far, and she had done it quickly. A moment later, the young lady handed him a small bag. Johann looked at her gift with bewilderment, but at the same time, he clearly heard his heart thundering in his chest. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that he could use it as a stash. She sighed heavily and said that she had nothing more to repay him with for his help. He looked at her intently because he knew what they said. When you really like a person, then happiness does not make you laugh but cry. He knew that if he exploded in front of the young lady, she would take him for a crazy idiot. He knew that he needed to restrain himself. She saw his reaction and asked if this was too plain a gift. She reached out to him and said that in that case, she would prepare something else for him. He pulled his gift towards himself with lightning speed and thanked her shyly. He smiled and said that it would become his family heirloom. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand what he was talking about. He froze in embarrassment and a moment later said that he would take care of him. The young lady said that she understood everything. A moment later, she said that in that case, she would leave him as it was too late, and he agreed with her. Johann looked closely at his favorite gift and thought that he needed to quickly send a letter home and ask them to send the best packaging for storing such a gift. He knew that this was already his treasure. Tonight, he was ready to die of happiness. The next day, the young man walked and beamed with happiness. All the passers-by on his way were touched by his beauty. A moment later, the young people saw the professor, and with the speed of lightning, scattered in different directions. The professor looked intently at the student. Johann, Professor Shaft, was the curator of the Magic Materials Making Club. She was responsible for the Magical Materials Club and was responsible for its low membership one day. While developing a potion that could dissolve anything, she accidentally dropped a hair into it, setting an entire floor of the tower on fire. After that incident, she shaved her head. She looked intently at the young man and said that it was very lucky that she had met him, since she just had news for the whole club. She said that when he saw Vincher, he should tell him to come to her, as the festival was coming soon, and he needed to get ready. She smiled and said that she had read his latest work with interest, and it was clear that he had studied the subject deeply. She looked at the young man intently and said with a smile that if he was not busy, he should take something to the clubroom. He looked at her intently, as if he understood that she always talked a lot and quickly. For this reason, everyone ran away from her. She looked at him intently and sighed heavily, said that she had chatted again. He smiled and said that she should not say that, since he was very grateful to her for giving him her time. She smiled and said that the Duke was very lucky if she was guaranteed to give birth to a son like him. She would leave a little hair. Johann only smiled, but said nothing. She smiled and said that she had a lesson soon, so she should leave already. For a moment, he froze in embarrassment as he remembered that the young lady had winked at him. He was a little surprised and puzzled as he was again immersed in his memories. Mark looked closely at his friend and said that the sign needed to be fixed or replaced since it swung every time someone opened the door. Wincher told Mark that it swung every time the door was opened and that it was a kind of bell. Mark looked at the young man in surprise and said that in that case, it would be better to hang a bell. A moment later, Johann entered the room and greeted everyone present with a smile. Vincher looked closely at the documents and sighed heavily, saying that it looked like the professor had worked hard. Johann smiled and said that she was always like that. Mark sighed heavily and said that there were exam papers every week and that everyone who joined the club sooner or later got tired of it and simply ran away. Mark looked closely at Johann, who was glowing with happiness. He knew that today was not the day of the club meeting. He did not understand why Johann was sitting here. He knew that Johann usually did not come to the club often. He wondered if the young man really had any extra time. A moment later, Mark noticed that the young man was taking something out of the bag. He was a little surprised and wondered if he had put the bag in the bag. Mark thought it was very strange, and it seemed to him that the young man was deliberately putting on a show. Mark's guess was correct. Johann would never have done something like that before it was immature. Namely, he would not have boasted about the gift, but now he was completely heard, he declared, and wanted to boast about the bag that the young lady made especially for him. Mark looked closely at the young man and asked if Elena had really given him a gift. Vinscher didn't pay any attention to them, but Johann froze for a moment. At her with fury, Mark, since he did not understand, since when he called her simply Elena, he was puzzled and did not understand how Mark guessed that the bag was from her. But still, the young man said that everything was exactly like that. Mark sighed heavily and said that he understood it, as the young man's gift simply reminded him of something. Johann froze in shock. He stared at the young man's gift and wondered if he was really looking at a glasses napkin. He was surprised because the lace around the edges of the napkin was familiar to him. He was furious and wondered if she had given them both gifts. With lightning speed, Johann stood up. Rita looked at the young people in surprise and asked what had happened. Mark smiled and said that nothing of the sort had happened. It was just that Johann was a very funny guy. The young lady smiled and said that she thought the same, and that just looking at his face made her want to laugh. She smiled and said that every time she saw him, she was amazed, because he looked very handsome. The young man sighed heavily and said that it was just nonsense. She looked at him closely and asked if he had had his eyes checked recently, since it seemed like his vision was starting to get worse. The young man sighed heavily and said irritably that his vision was fine. Everything was fine. Mark looked closely at his friend, since he saw that he was being sarcastic again. He knew that his friend was not like that at all. Rita looked closely at the young man and said that his sister was also completely indifferent to Johann. She did not understand whether all members of their family lacked a sense of beauty. He said that he had no problems with his eyesight, and he needed a monocle in order to look at something closer. Mark looked closely at the young people and sighed heavily. He thought that their club was a complete mess. He sighed heavily and thought that they should change the name to a love circle. Mark smiled and thought that they wouldn't be bored for a while. Johann sighed heavily. He drooped because he was very upset. He did not understand why the sky was so clear and cloudless today. He looked closely at the young lady who sat next to him. Johann wondered why he thought that she was able to make a gift only for him. He sighed heavily because he knew that in his joy, he had imagined himself to be special to her. The professor looked at everyone present intently and said that in order to repeat the material, he would ask them a few questions. He looked closely at the young people sitting in the audience and said that there were 2 students present who had received the highest marks in the entrance exam. He looked at the young lady and asked if she could answer him. The young lady in turn looked intently at the professor and answered the question with lightning speed. A moment later, Johann joined the professor's questioning and also answered the question posed. The professor in turn looked closely at the young people and said with a smile that they had not deceived his expectations. He looked at them closely and said with a smile that he had a feeling he would see their names at the top of the list again. Johann glanced furtively at the young lady who turned to face him. She quietly whispered something to him. Johann looked at the young lady in bewilderment, as he did not quite understand what she was saying. A moment later, she turned around and sat up normally. He stared at her in bewilderment, not understanding what she said. For a moment, he considered her whisper. He thought that he could interpret her words not as the language of the empire, but as an ancient language. But still, he wondered what she meant. He wondered if she really meant that this time she would come first again. He froze in place with embarrassment as he realized what she was thinking about him. He thought that most likely the gift to Mark was simply a token of gratitude for the gynecological book. He understood perfectly well that the glasses cloth was no match for the bag, since his gift required more fabric and more time, and effort was put into the work, which makes his gift much more valuable. He stood there for a moment, confused, because he knew she was too cute. He didn't know what to do. He didn't understand how she could be so cute. Elena slowly entered the office and saw the young lady. She looked at her intently and greeted her with restraint, and Emily greeted the young lady in return. A moment later, They sat quietly, each reading her own book. Emily walked slowly past the academy students and heard them say that she was kind of weird. They said that she was constantly interested in some useless things and said strange things. Young people made fun of her, saying that she was strange. She was very puzzled by this, since it was always difficult for her to communicate with people. She didn't feel any hatred for those around her, for her people. On the contrary, she wanted to get closer to them. However, only her relatives did not ignore her and considered any of her questions normal. She was also supported by her childhood friend Mark. She wanted to study one book, and the young people advised her to contact Elena since she had this book. They said she could have just asked the young lady directly. Emily knew other people thought she was weird. She looked closely at the young lady and wondered if this question would embarrass her. She wanted to know about the origin of magic in the Viscountcy. Emily sighed heavily because she knew she shouldn't do this. She knew the club would get into trouble if she didn't like her questions, and she decided to leave. The young lady looked at Emily intently and asked her if she liked the book. Emily looked at the lady in surprise and asked if she knew it. Elena said with a smile that of course she knew this book, since she read it first. When she entered the academy, Emily was a little surprised, since she knew that this book was not well known to anyone. The young lady said with a smile that she first heard about her from Emily. Emily thought for a moment and remembered the moment when she had talked about this book. She thought that, in retrospect, her behavior then had been extremely tactless, but she wondered if she should apologize. Elena looked at the young lady with a smile and said that the book was very interesting and she had read it with pleasure. She read this book. She looked at Emily intently and asked if she would recommend any other book. Emily froze in surprise. She did not expect this at all. She knew she had to say something. A moment later, she sheepishly told me about another book. The young lady looked at Emily intently and thanked her with a smile. She said that she would finish reading this book and would immediately read the one Emily recommended to her. Emily looked at the young lady shyly and asked if she could ask her something. A moment later, she asked the lady how many people were in her family. Elena looked intently at Emily and said that now in her family, there was only her and her mother. Emily sighed heavily as she had recently heard that her father had died. She was more concerned about whether she had any brothers or sisters. She realized that she apparently had none. She wondered if they had died too, but she knew that it was very rude to ask. The young Emily froze for a moment as she realized it was very noticeable. She was surprised because no one had ever cared about what she was interested in before. The young lady looked at Emily intently and asked if she had any more questions or not. Emily looked at her closely, as she was familiar with the girl's intonation. She saw that she was not trying to shame her, but was asking if she wanted to know anything else. The girl's intonation now reminded her of her brother's intonation. Emily looked at the young lady closely and said that she had heard that she had magic. She asked her what about her parents. Elena looked at Emily closely and said that her parents had nothing to do with magic, and as far as she knew, she had no relatives who were incapable of magic. She thought for a moment, as she knew that the book said that according to the records, the Viscount was the only mage in the family. She thought that perhaps the young lady being born with the blood of a mage was a unique case. She said that in her family too, mages were born, although it was very rare. Emily said shyly that she also dreamed of becoming one. The young lady looked at Emily in surprise, as she had not expected to hear such a thing at all. Emily said sheepishly that of course this was impossible now, but she had once really hoped for it. The young lady in turn looked intently at Emily, but said nothing. Emily frowned and wondered if she had said something useless. Unfortunately, she did not feel any magical powers within herself, but since childhood, she passionately wanted to become a magician. But unfortunately, everyone did nothing but laugh at her. She sighed heavily and thought that she should not have said that. The young lady looked at Emily closely and said with a smile that this was very good. Now she understood why Emily joined the club. She looked closely at Emily and asked if she had told the professor about this. She said that she thought the professor would be very interested. Emily looked at the young lady with confusion and said that she had spoken about this, and to her surprise, she said that there had been previous research in this area. Although all of them had been unsuccessful, Elena said that unfortunately, there is no research without failures. She smiled and said that she was sure that one day Emily would definitely succeed. She said that she too always wanted to know why she and his family were born with magic. Elena's told the girl that if she needed help with her research, she could feel free to contact her. Elena P. looked at the girl and asked if she could mention her name later so that everyone would know that the Viscount's mouth had not stopped. Emily smiled and said that of course she would definitely do that. She also asked if she could just call her by her first name. The young lady smiled and said that she seemed to always call her by her first name. A moment later, Emily boldly called the young lady's name. Mark looked in surprise at his friend, who was standing quietly behind the door. He looked at his friend with a smile and asked why he froze. He told his friend that he could come in now. Mark reached for the door handle with lightning speed, but his friend stopped him. Fincher looked closely at his friend and said that if he came for assignments, then they are in his room, and he can go there. He looked at his friend in surprise and asked if they were really not in the clubroom. Fincher said that they were there. Mark looked at his friend in surprise, as he didn't understand why he had to go to the dorm when he could just go to his room. The young man sighed heavily and said that his sister was inside him. Mark looked at his friend in surprise, as he did not understand what the problem was. A moment later, Mark froze in place as he heard the girls talking. Looking around the door, he saw that they were talking very animatedly. Mark sighed heavily and said that it was the first time he had seen the young lady talk to someone else in such a manner. Mark said that she was a good girl, as the young lady was very good as a friend. Fincher froze for a moment, but did not answer his friend, even though he said that the young lady seemed like a nice girl. Mark asked his friend with a smile if he really liked her, but he didn't answer. Mark knew that he wouldn't confess anyway. The young lady in turn walked slowly to the library and carried a large stack of books. She knew that during exam times, these books were impossible to obtain, and buying them all was expensive. She sighed heavily because she knew that she needed to get them back quickly. A moment later, the young lady collided with someone, and a mountain of books flew at her. A moment later, she froze in place in surprise as a young man caught her. She looked at him in surprise as she wondered if it was Johann in front of her. The young man with lightning speed helped the young lady and put the books back in place. She looked at him intently and asked for forgiveness, since she did not notice him at all, and accidentally pushed him. He smiled and said that it was no big deal, since he himself was lost in thought and did not look around. He looked at her intently and said that her books looked very heavy. He smiled and said that he could help her. The young lady in turn looked intently at the young man, because for a second she thought that Johann was standing in front of her in all his glory. She saw that they were very similar. The young man looked at her in bewilderment. He smiled a beaming smile and asked me if she was hurt. Elena Yu smiled and said that everything was fine, and also thanked him for his concern. She asked if she had hurt him badly. He smiled and said that as far as she could see, he was alive. She thought for a moment as she saw that their voices were similar. She remembered that her friend had an older brother. He looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if she had just thought that he and Johann were very similar to each other. The young lady was taken aback and timidly said that it was exactly like that. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he understood this because her eyes widened when she saw him. He smiled and said that his name was Isaac, and he was Johann's older brother. A moment later, the young lady introduced herself. He smiled and said that, in that case, he should introduce himself with his full name. The young lady in turn noticed that the young man laughed a lot. He looked at her intently and asked if she was into fencing. Elena looked at the young man intently and said that she was still learning the basics. He smiled and said that he thought she would succeed in it. She sighed heavily and said that, of course it was so, since she was generally counting on it. He looked at her with a radiant smile and also asked if she was friends with his brother. The young lady said that she was friends with him. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he understood it. Isaac looked at the young lady intently, for he had not heard her name before, but no matter how he looked at her, it seemed to him that they knew each other. Johann walked around the training ground, waiting for the young lady. He was preening himself, as he wanted to look in all his glory in front of her. He thought he was looking for the young lady in a hurry, because he noticed that she was late for their training. He looked for a moment. Johann concentrated, and moments later, he raised his sword. After his little training, he said the young lady's name. A moment later, he stood there in confusion, not understanding why he had suddenly said her name, as he knew she was not here with him. The young lady in turn answered him. Johann turned around and froze in shock and embarrassment, as he had not expected to see her at all. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile how he knew she was there. She smiled and said that when she saw him training, she came in very quietly, trying not to disturb him. He looked at her with a smile, because he knew that he couldn't give her an answer, since he had just noticed her. He couldn't tell her that he had simply said her name. Johann smiled and said that he felt it on his back, but if she trains hard one day, she can do it too. The young lady smiled and said that she was wrong when she thought that he was only skilled with a sword. Johann smiled and said that it seemed like she was flattering him. He said that he was not that good. She looked at him closely and said that now she understood why there were rumors that the best knights were in his family. He knew that because of the brothers' struggle for power, the Perton R clan had unleashed a war, and this was not a matter of the distant past, but of the previous generation, and the current duke had emerged victorious from it. He knew that the chaos that had happened then should not be repeated again. She asked what he wanted to do in the future. He looked at Johann. His family never took an interest in him, and no one expected anything from him. He looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not understand why she was the only one asking about his dream. He looked at her with a smile, and with confusion on his face, he did not understand why hurry. Some time later, everyone was looking closely at the performance ranking of the academy. For the first semester, Elena took first place and scored the highest score. Johann took second place. They were surprised because she scored the highest score. Johann looked closely at her list, doing well. He knew that she had attended more classes than him and still got the highest score. He thought that the young lady was simply incredible. He remembered when she quietly said something to him, that sweet provocation had ignited a thirst for competition in him, but at the sight of the points, the ardor in him diminished. He knew that he could have bypassed it before, if he had wanted to, but he suddenly had no desire to spend a lot of time studying. He thought for a moment, as he saw his scores. He realized that he was 1 point short because of the history lesson when he and the lady were in class together. Then the quiz dragged on. They broke the record that was set last time. Then Johann, he was shocked and confused. He didn't understand why she was making so many sounds that made them stretch out as if for a kiss. In the end, a moment later, he entered the club room, and without looking at those present, greeted them. Johann, he looked closely at the young man, as he saw that he was speaking rather relaxedly. A moment later, he realized who was in front of him. Johann looked at Mark in surprise and called him. Mark smiled and said that it was him. He just took off his glasses because his eyes were already tired. Johann was in shock. He wondered if it was really that same Mark in front of him. He looked closely at the young man as he saw that without his glasses, he was a completely different person. Johann smiled and said that he understood him. Mark in turn frowned at the young man. Mark sighed as he realized that the theater department was crying for Johann. He thought that it must be hard to live when you don't know which side of you is real. Johann was shocked and thought it was a very serious defeat since he had been dealt a serious opponent with a beautiful face. He knew that, of course, it was unlikely, but he was worried that if the young lady took a closer look at the brand, she might fall in love with him. He understood that it was possible that her taste was not in perfect, flawless faces, but in ordinary ones. Johann looked closely at the young man as he wanted him to put on his glasses as quickly as possible. A moment later, a young lady entered their office and greeted them. They turned and stared at the young lady. She told Johann that he was very early today. Johann smiled and said that he had run out of a subject last week, and that was the reason he was so early. He looked at her closely because he knew that it was natural that she would say hello to the one she saw first, but it still hurt his heart. Mark smiled and said that it looked like her record wouldn't be broken for a long time. He remembered what was written there about the warm atmosphere between young people. He noticed that the young lady's expression was softer than usual now. Mark looked closely at the young man and said that he would also like to congratulate him. Johann smiled and thanked him, but he in turn was burning with anger. She smiled and said that it couldn't be otherwise. Mark smiled and said he was just joking. Johann in turn looked at the young people with puzzlement, as he saw that the atmosphere between them was very friendly. Mark glanced sideways at the young man, as he saw that he was frowning angrily as he looked at him. The young lady looked closely at Johann and asked how many items he had. He looked closely at Johann because he did not understand why he behaved in such a way. He did not understand what he saw in the young lady. Looking at him, he wondered why the noble son of the Duke was simply swooning and melting before his eyes. He looked closely at the young lady as he saw that she was not particularly remarkable in appearance. He did not understand how she had managed to attract such an extraordinary man. He looked closely at her beautiful eyes and thought that she was as beautiful as a picture, but a moment later, he pulled back and froze in shock as he realized what he was thinking. For a moment, he thought and thought that she was truly beautiful, and he couldn't take his gaze off her. But a few minutes later, he caught an evil look on himself that burned him. He looked at Johann and noticed that he would soon burn a hole in him. Mark looked intently at Rita and said, and he started to speak, but his friend stopped him. He looked closely at everyone present, because he realized that whether they were hiding or not, all their problems were clearly visible. Vincher looked closely at everyone present and said that, as they already knew, a festival would soon take place, and within a few days, each club would be holding some kind of event within the budget. This was precisely the reason they had gathered. He looked closely at everyone present and said that he would like to hear their ideas. What potion is better to sell? Rita looked at him in surprise and asked if they really had to come up with something right now. He said that there was no need for that, and they had a few days to come up with something. Wincher said that in a few days, they would meet again and write down all their ideas on pieces of paper and hand them in, and then the potion would be chosen by secret vote, and the winner would receive a cash reward, albeit a small one. He looked closely at the young lady and asked what she wanted to know. She looked at him intently and asked how much the reward was. He said that, unfortunately, they were short on funds, so only 10 coins. She thought for a moment, as she knew that this was not bad. The young man looked at her intently and said that the payment would be in francs. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She knew that this payment would not be in copper coins, but in silver ones. She knew that this was exactly half of the payment for the lace. A moment later, she was eager to win this event. Johann looked closely at the young lady, as he knew that he had to find out her idea and vote for it. He said that last year, they had held a competition in greenery knowledge among the club members. Rita said that anyone who wants to participate in such competitions can participate. He said that the only thing that matters to them is the result. Rita sighed heavily and said that in the end, no one passed. He looked closely at everyone present and said that this year they were holding different events. Accordingly, the result would be different. Next time, they would discuss everything in detail. He looked closely at everyone present and said that this was where they would end their meeting. Johann looked at everyone present and said that he knew they were all very busy, but asked if they could spare him a minute. He smiled and said that he had something special prepared for everyone. He said that the school term was coming to an end and the festival was just around the corner, so he thought of cheering up their humble group with a small gift. The young lady opened the small case in bewilderment and froze for a moment. She saw a beautiful feather that was simply sparkling. Rita looked at the young man in surprise and said that his gift was simply amazing. Vincher looked at the young man in surprise and said that he did not expect that he would care about them so much, but he still thanked him. Johann looked closely at the young lady because he did not see any reaction. She was silent for a while. Johann saw that she was very happy. Mark looked closely at the young man as he saw that he was trying very hard, and he was not even averse to using the club members for the sake of his love. The lady looked at her friend in surprise and asked what she was going to do. She sighed heavily and said that she thought she should look for teachers. Elena looked at her and asked what subjects she would look for teachers for. She smiled and said that it was probably the same for everyone, as she was missing the basics. The young lady sighed heavily and spoke about her friend. So that she would understand her correctly, she asked her how she got into the academy in the first place. The young lady smiled and said that she had passed a special selection as a princess. She smiled and said that she was after all a member of the royal family, and she still knew the ancient language very well. Elena sighed heavily and called her friend by her full name. Jilly looked at her neighbor with confusion and said that she had a very ominous tone, and it scared her. Elena P. looked at her friend and said that she had practically failed her exams and had nowhere to go back to. She was puzzled and didn't know what her friend was planning to do next. The princess sighed heavily and told her neighbor that it wasn't for nothing that she was in first place, since she had now put everything in its place. Jilly's confession, she said that she would have to study hard during the holidays, since she was falling behind in her studies. The young lady smiled and said that she had a very good idea, and while she was relaxing in the kingdom, she would quickly catch up with everything. The young lady smiled and said that she would not go home for the holidays. She said that she would only tell everything in secret now. She said with a smile that she ran away from the kingdom and could not return back, otherwise she would find herself in the middle of a struggle for the throne, and then most likely she would die. Elena looked at her friend in surprise and asked where she would live during the holidays. The princess smiled and said that she needed to look for an idea. She told her neighbor not to worry since she had money saved up for this. The young lady sighed heavily and called the princess. She asked her if she had decided which subjects she would attend next semester. The princess sighed heavily and said that she had not thought about it yet, since classes had only ended yesterday. The young lady looked at her neighbor and said that she could leave the next semester to her. She said that the princess did not have to look for a teacher for every subject, but would have been better off hiring one for a low price. The princess was delighted with this idea. She smiled and told her friend that she would help her out very much. She smiled and said that she knew almost no one in the empire. Elena looked at the princess intently and said that she would have to put up with her teaching method. Since she herself said that she lacked the basics, the princess looked away for a moment and said that she did not remember such a thing. The young lady sighed heavily and told her friend that she was not forcing her at all, since it was her business, but it required her time and money. She said that the choice was hers. The princess smiled and said that she had no intention of refusing, since she really needed it. Elena looked askance at her friend and said that, in that case, they could go. The princess asked, in surprise, if they were really going to dinner so early today. The young lady said that it was not so, and they were heading to the library. The princess looked at her friend intently and said that they did not have to start studying right now. The young man looked intently at the girls, but still his gaze was riveted most of all on Elena. He looked at the young lady and said that he knew that the girl had replaced his brother and that now he was not in first place. He looked closely at his companion and asked with a smile how she knew her. He wanted to know if they were friends. The young lady looked at him indignantly and said that he was talking complete nonsense. She asked if she really looked like the kind of person who would be friends with such a girl. She said sheepishly that she was just her client. She sighed heavily and told the young man not to say that they were friends anymore, as it was unpleasant for her. He smiled and said that he understood everything. She sighed heavily and said that she could never understand what kind of person would decide to devote all their free time to studying from the very beginning to the end. She saw the young Felisa S. said that they were only paired once during class, and even then the professor put them together. The young man sighed heavily. He did not understand why she reacted so sharply when he mentioned the young lady's name. He thought that he should have watched them more closely. The young lady, in turn, sat quietly and studied all the potions that she could use in the upcoming event. She thought that a potion that would repel insects would be a good option. The young lady looked at her intently and said that it was simply impossible, but in turn, the princess did not listen to her. The princess looked closely at her neighbor and asked why she was choosing a potion. Elena S. said that their club decided to sell the potion at the festival, so she was thinking about which one to offer. The princess looked at her friend and said that she thought no one would want to buy the insect repellent potion. The young lady looked at the princess in bewilderment, as she thought it was very useful. The princess smiled and asked what about the love potion. The young lady in turn said that such a potion was prohibited by law. The princess suggested a few more options, but all of them were forbidden. She sighed heavily and said that it seemed that everything was strict in their empire. The young lady looked closely at the princess, as she knew that it was very good that she grew up normal in her kingdom. The young lady thanked the princess for her advice and said that she should finish reading the material. Jilly, in turn, was shocked by such pressure. She looked at her friend and said that she knew no mercy. The princess wished her good luck. She, in turn, was very happy, since she would finally be able to rest. The young lady looked at the princess intently and said that when she returned, she would check what the princess had learned. Jilly sighed heavily and told her friend that in that case she could take her time. The young lady, in turn, walked leisurely down the corridor. She wanted to ask Rita about these potions. She knew the girl had been involved in trade since childhood, and she must be well versed in it. She slowly walked into the third-year student's office. The young lady looked into the office in search of her friend. A moment later, she saw her. She froze in place, as she noticed that Rita was sad about something. Elena froze for a moment, as she saw that the lady looked different from usual. She wondered if she should go up and talk to her. She thought that she still shouldn't do that, as it seemed like she didn't want to show herself like that in front of others. For a moment, she thought and thought that Rita was now the same as she was, pretending to be cheerful and carefree in front of her sick mother. She decided to ask her about potions another time. But a moment later, the young lady noticed a young man who approached Rita. She noted. Fincher in turn looked at her with a soft smile. The young lady walked back slowly. She knew that she had done the right thing by not entering the office. He asked Johann if the Duke was playing the indifferent father again. For some time, the young man speculated about what the letter was about. He understood perfectly well that the letter contained dry greetings and questions the answers to which he did not care about. The Duke wrote to his son that he had not lived up to his expectations. He asked his son if he really thought that he didn't have to try at all. He told his son that he shouldn't be arrogant. Todd, with a smile, asked Johann if the Duke was really as disappointed as last time. He smiled and said that he thought the Duke should learn not to be disappointed, since Johann would apparently remain second. Moments later, the young man froze in place. He looked at his friend in surprise and asked if it was really a certain person who didn't have a pillow. Johann in turn sighed heavily and said that he was right. The young man looked at his friend in surprise and asked in bewilderment if he really agreed with him. He was surprised because he knew that the Johann he knew would not have answered so quickly. A moment later, Johann hit his friend. He was surprised and asked Johann why he was fighting like that, as he just wanted to check if he was sick. Johann sighed heavily and said that he was fine and asked his friend not to touch him. Johann sighed heavily and said sadly that his father needed to get used to being disappointed, since he would have many reasons to do so. The young man looked at his friend in bewilderment, as he did not understand what was happening to him. Todd P. fell onto the bed and sighed heavily, saying that he never understood his father, since the Duke asked him to try, but at the same time, he humiliated him with his words. He looked at his friend and asked if the Duke was still against his desire to become a magician. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed to be obvious. Johann sighed heavily, as he knew that he couldn't become a knight either, lest he surpass his older brother Meiji, being of a lower status, so the path there was also closed to him. In their era, magic was highly valued, and only a few with conservative views treated magicians so dismissively. One of such people was the Duke. The young man was puzzled and did not understand why the Duke could not allow him to live his own life. He knew that Johann was not allowed to stand out and relax either. He thought that everyone in his family had gone crazy. Todd looked at his friend and said that it didn't apply to him, as he was perfectly healthy. He breathed a sigh of relief as he saw that his friend understood everything. The young man looked at his friend with a smile and began to support him in his own way. Johann was grateful to his friend. He knew that his family of knights, who were infinitely devoted to the emperor, here he was born and received a name that he should proudly bear. All this was of such great importance that he never dared to contradict his father. For a moment he thought and remembered the young lady. She had asked him about his thoughts. Then, she wanted to know what he really wanted to do. He sighed heavily and wondered if he could continue to live like this. The young lady looked closely at the new horse. She was seeing it for the first time. She remembered that she had recently been asked to take care of a horse that had been sent from the Marquis's residence. She wondered if it was really her. A moment later, she heard someone's voice and turned around. Mark looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not expect to see her at all. She in turn looked at him with bewilderment, as she was surprised to see him in such a place. Mark gasped and asked if she didn't know it was his horse. He said he thought he had mentioned it. The young lady looked at him intently and said she would remember that today. She looked closely at the young man, as she saw that the horse suited him perfectly. Mark asked the lady why she looked so surprised. He said that it hurt him. She said she used to think he preferred the crew. He looked at him closely and asked if she wanted to go for a ride. Elena S. said that she usually doesn't refuse. He smiled and asked who would refuse. She looked closely at the horse and asked what its name was. The young man, without taking his eyes off the young lady, said that his horse's name was Hilta. The lady looked at the horse with a bright smile and called her by name. Mark looked at her intently and asked if she had been so good with horses since childhood. Elena S. said that this was not so, and Johann taught her this. Mark looked at her in surprise and asked how she got a job in the stable. She looked at him intently and said that nothing was impossible. He slowly extended his hand to her and said that he would now sit her down. She agreed with him. Mark looked closely at the young lady as he saw that she had very small hands. Having asked for forgiveness, he with the speed of lightning seated her on the horse. He looked at her in surprise as he saw that she was as light as a feather. He noticed that she had a very restrained delight. Mark knew that her facial expression gave her away. He noticed that she was not at all what she seemed at first glance. He noticed that she was a lively and fragile lady. He wondered if that was why he couldn't stop looking at her. She smiled and thanked him for giving her this opportunity. He smiled and said that it was no wonder that she was so good at everything, since everything was clean and without unnecessary movements. A moment later, the young men turned around as someone called the lady. Johann looked at her with a smile as he had finally found her. But in a moment, Johann's expression changed. The young lady looked at Johann in surprise. Mark, in turn, looked intently at the young man, as he looked as if he had caught the lady cheating. Mark looked at the young man intently, knowing that his feelings were not mutual. He smirked and wondered what he had to worry about. He was a little excited, knowing that the young lady had been working in the stables today. He knew that, in other words, this was just a wonderful opportunity to be alone with her. However, he went searching, but it was all in vain. He froze in shock as he realized that they had been unexpectedly interrupted. He quickly approached the young people and said that his horse was sick. The lady asked the Mark if he would go for a ride. Mark looked at the young lady and said that she could take the horse to the stable as he had to go back. Johann separated them, citing his horse's illness. The young lady walked up to the horse, looked at it, and asked how it was feeling. She was surprised because she saw that the horse was healthy. But a moment later, the young lady screamed as the horse fell. The young man, in turn, was very glad that the horse listened to him. Johann looked at his companion and said with a smile that the horse seemed to be feeling better. Ilana sighed heavily and said that she didn't see any wounds anywhere. She didn't understand what had happened to him. She was worried and wondered if he was really okay. The young man, in turn, looked intently at the lady. He was happy and wanted to admire this picture forever. He knew that he should not despair at all and that he had to quickly make up for lost time. He could offer her to participate in the races, where there was a cash reward, and under the pretext of training, invite her to his home. He knew that everything would turn out just perfect. He was very positive, as he knew that he would certainly win the young lady's heart. Vincher looked carefully at everyone present and said that today they would decide which potions would be sold during the festival. He handed everyone present a sheet of paper and said that they should write down their ideas, and as soon as the sheets were collected, they would hold a vote, and first and second place would receive a cash prize. He looked at everyone present and said that they could begin. He glanced sideways at the young lady, as he knew he needed to determine what potion she had chosen. He knew it wouldn't be hard to figure out, as she had come up with something ingenious. The young man looked closely at everyone present and said that all the sheets had been submitted and they could look at the applicants. He said that the first idea is a coloring potion. It is written that it acts separately on the eyes, hair, eyebrows, and others. Johann was surprised as the potion and its preparation were well thought out. He glanced sideways at the lady's magic, wondering if she could offer such a thing. He looked at her closely as he realized that she would hardly react this way to her own idea. Winchero sounded like the next potion, which changed a person's voice, raising it by several tones. Johann thought the idea was very interesting, but rather controversial. He thought it was not suitable for the young lady. The young man looked closely at Mark, as the sheet said that he would vote for someone else. A moment later, the young man pulled out the last sheet. He read the title in surprise and froze as someone offered him a clear eye potion. Johann froze in place in surprise, as he did not understand what he had heard. The young man read all of its advantages and how it could be used. Johann froze in surprise, as he did not understand who would buy it. For a moment he wondered who had suggested it. He had his own guesses. He smiled and thought about the first option. But a moment later, he looked at the young lady in surprise as she suddenly became quiet. He wondered if she had gotten tired in such a short time. He froze in surprise when he saw the expression on her face. A moment later, he realized that the idea was hers. He was shocked and wondered how he could have thought of such a thing, her proposals. He understood perfectly well that this was not quite right for a festival. He wondered if she didn't understand what a festival was. Johann wondered if she had never attended these events. He froze in place as he realized that she had lost her father early and had worked a lot since then, and she did not have time to go to such events. He looked sideways at the young lady with tears in his eyes. A moment later, the young people began voting. For his beloved's idea with tears in his eyes, he understood that no one but him would vote for this potion. A moment later, the young man said that they could now count the votes. He said that the potion of clear eyes was only one voice. Johann, with a satisfied smile, realized that it was only his. But a moment later, the young man said that someone else had voted for the potion. He exhaled heavily as he realized that he had miraculously snatched second place. But a moment later, he heard someone else vote for the potion. Johann was shocked as he understood that the logic of the members of this club was beyond his comprehension. Johann glanced sideways at the young lady as he noticed that she was happy. He knew that the dubious future of some club was nothing compared to this. Venture S said that first place was tied, and both winners should contact him separately. Rita screamed excitedly and asked if they would really break up like that. She was screaming that they needed to discuss a sales concept and they needed to come up with something special. He sighed heavily and said that he just wanted to make a potion and sell it. The young lady was in shock. She shouted to everyone present that this simply couldn't happen. She didn't want them to lose like last year. She shouted that they must not repeat their mistakes. She stipulated that the situation was different now. She shouted that Johann had joined them and they should make the most of him. She said that he is not the only one they have, as they also have very valuable personnel. Johann looked closely at the young lady as he understood that she had spoken very well up until then, but he did not understand why she had taken the mark into account. Rita looked at the young man and asked if he would mind taking off his glasses. He thought for a moment and said that it could be removed. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was serious now, and she also thanked him. Mark glanced sideways at the young man, as he knew that this was a challenge for him, as Johann had recently made a similar attempt to get closer to the lady. Johann looked closely at the young man, as this was all very suspicious, and he had a bad feeling. Elena slowly returned with a gift in her hands. She was glad because thanks to the young lady's scope, shows that she has a very good salary this month. In addition, she was given a special award from the academy. She added a reward for maintaining the meticulous garden and her enormous contribution to the beauty of the landscape. The young lady was glad because she realized that someone had actually told about her efforts. She thanked the anonymous young man with golden hair. Her friend also passed the exam very well, and they will see each other next semester. She was surprised as there were many people around her who were ready to help her in everything. She was a little surprised because her life turned out to be very joyful. The young lady came to her mother with a smile on her face, as well as a prepared gift. The lady looked at her daughter in surprise and asked why she bought it. She said that she never left the house anyway. The lady told her mother that her clothes were already worn out. She looked at her mother and asked if she really wanted criticism directed at them. Madame was surprised and could not imagine who dared to condemn her daughter. The young lady looked closely at the medicines her mother was taking, as there were too few of the new ones, and suspiciously many of the old ones. She asked her mother if she needed new medicines. The lady said that she didn't need them, as she could easily stretch out the intake of those she had. The lady smiled and said that she had enough medicine, and she didn't need any more. She said that besides the price of the medicine had gone up. Elena looked closely at her mother and said that she was already earning well, and this time she received a scholarship again, so there was no need to worry about spending. She said that she had a lot of money now. The lady smiled and said that if everything went to her, then nothing would be left for her daughter. She said that she knew her body better, so everything was fine. The young lady in turn screamed angrily and told her mother to stop. The young lady was leisurely going about her business. She knew that she was on vacation. She needed to start lessons with her neighbor and decide on the number of embroideries to be delivered. A moment later, someone called her, but she was immersed in her thoughts and did not hear anyone. She knew that if her mother's illness worsened, she would not have enough money to call a doctor. She knew that she needed to look for a new job. Johann walked excitedly up to the young lady and tugged her hand, calling her. He looked at her closely and said that she needed to add blue leaves, not scarlet ones. The young lady was taken aback and thanked her friend for his help. She realized that she had almost added the wrong ingredient. He suggested that she take a break, and she agreed. Johann looked closely at the young lady and called her. He wanted to know what was wrong with her. She sighed heavily and said that everything was fine, and nothing had happened to her. They sat quietly for a while. He sighed and said that after joining the academy, he felt absolutely terrible for several days. Johann said he was embarrassed to admit it, but he was restless, and then he accidentally stumbled upon the garden. He said that he walked wherever his eyes looked because he wanted to unwind a little. He smiled and said that that day he met a girl who told him that he was not smiling. He looked closely at the young lady and said that she had supported him then. He smiled, and looking at her, said that then she called him a friend. He said that she herself did not know, but she helped him a lot. Johann said that he would be happy to answer her in kind because she is his friend. He in turn did not want to just be friends with her, either now or in the future, but he knew that now this was the only way to be close to her. She sighed heavily and said that she simply didn't know a lot of things before and lived her life, but now everything has changed a lot, and it scares her. He smiled and asked if she knew about the festival. She said that she had heard about it. Leaflets with news about the upcoming festival were flying all over the area, and she was the one who was in charge of these leaflets. He looked at her closely and asked if she wanted to go with him. He smiled and said that it would be great if her mother joined them. He said that unfortunately he doesn't remember his mother well since she died a long time ago. Johann smiled and said that perhaps the Viscountess would accept him as a son. He knew that he would prefer not as a son, but as a son-in-law. The young lady looked at him with a smile. She thanked him and said that she was very glad that he told her everything. He looked at her intently and said that knowing whether he was worthy of her gratitude, he looked at her with a smile and said that it was time for them to go. The young lady in turn also looked at him with a soft smile and agreed with him. The young lady looked at everyone present and said that today they should decide on the concept of their club. During the festival, she said that everyone should suggest their ideas. Emily looked at the crowd and said she had one thought. A moment later, she told everyone present about everything, and after finishing the wedding story, she said that if they didn't like her idea, then she wouldn't insist. Wincher started to say that her idea was good, but a moment later, the young lady interrupted him and with a smile told Emily that it was a very excellent one idea. Elena Yu smiled and said that they could dress up as magicians and sell potions. Emily looked closely at everyone present. She was glad that everyone supported her. Rita said with a joyful smile that then everything was decided and she would certainly get busy preparing the costumes. Mark looked at his friend in surprise and asked where he had disappeared to. Since the lesson had long since ended, he sighed heavily and said that he had one thing to do. He noticed that his friend had a special book on the ancient language. He wondered if it was all because of Rita. Mark told his friend that he thought he dreamed of becoming a scientist, but it seemed he had decided to become a teacher. The young man sighed heavily as his friend was irritating him. He spoke as if he knew everything. He said that Rita had always had problems with her studies, and she almost failed her exams, and he was just giving her a little help as a fellow club member. Mark smiled and said that maybe that was true. Fincher looked at his friend with bewilderment and asked what he was getting at. Mark smiled and asked his friend with a grin, "Since when?" He sighed heavily as he did not know the answer to the question asked. He said that at first he was just curious how long she would last. He said that the young lady always stayed with them at the club no matter what. Mark looked at his friend with a smile and asked if he knew what it was called when interest in another person arises. Fincher sighed heavily and said that he should not talk about this. He asked his friend what to call the sudden change in his behavior. Looking at his friend, he said that he could not answer since he did not really care, but still he advised him to behave decently. Mark, with a smirk, told his friend that he was talking as if he was causing trouble.